Zero Foxtrot does not profess to share or promote the opinions and beliefs expressed by show host or guests. The Stay Zero podcast was created to provide a platform for servicemen and women to share their stories. Due to the nature of this podcast, sensitive topics will arise. Conversations about combat, PTSD, drug use, and other such subjects will occur. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome back to the Stay Zero podcast. Our guest today is Keith Bunger. Keith did 6 years with the Arizona, New Mexico National Guard, and he's a member of the Airborne Demo Team since 2008, right?
Yep, since 2008.
Yeah, and do you own Standing Rock?
So the company that I own is called Stand in the Door 1944.
Stand in the Door, not Standing Rock. That's a totally different thing.
Yeah.
So Stand in the Door, and you make museum replicas, right?
Correct. So I make replicas for museums, for reenactors, for film, and stuff like that. So I try and make some of the most historically accurate gear that's ever been made, gear, dummy hand grenades, that type of thing.
Right.
That kind of helps bring an extra layer of authenticity to, reenactors or to film productions and so forth.
Man, of all the wars, Vietnam, I think, was a big one for me as well. And maybe just because of my age, right? I grew up in the 80s, 90s. Yeah. So a lot of the movies that I watched. But World War II has been the most fascinating to study, personally. Why did you pick that one for you? Do you feel the same way, or?
Oh, for sure. Literally, like my whole life is geared around World War II.
Why World War II? Why did you pick that one, or what was it that planted that seed?
I think that that kind of started whenever I was really young. I mean, I was a kid. Mm-hmm. I'd probably say as young as 5, 6, 7, right around there. Because every time that my mom and sister would go out of town for, one reason or another, my dad and I would stay home, and we would go down to the local, VHS video store, and we'd rent old war movie, like PT-109 and To Hell and Back and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And that's what we would do, go down to Video City and pick out all these classics, all the war movies that he grew up on, and even in the old TV shows like old Combat and stuff like that with Vic Morrow, and we'd watch episode after episode of that, and that's kind of where my interest got piqued as far as World War II is concerned, and that's where my life started to kind of shift into like military based stuff, because before then it was all like Batman toys and all that kind of stuff, but
real life toys.
And then going in and kind of what really thrust kind of World War II into like the spotlight for me was probably a series of toys called Ultimate Soldier, and they were like 12-inch, most people would call them like GI Joes, but they had like super realistic uniforms and equipment and stuff like that, like they actually looked like World War II soldiers, and they were like about $30 a piece or so. So
that's
whenever I'd be
for a toy,
but when I'd go and I was always working for my dad doing yard work and stuff like that. And, all my money was going towards, buying those things and, Jeeps and half tracks and, sewing sandbags and stuff like that for all these guys to, recreate World War II photos and stories and stuff like that I've heard. And so that's what kind of started it for me. And like literally that is what pushed it into like the real part of my life. From there, I saw Saving Private Ryan, about a year after it came out in theaters in 98. So I was pretty young at the time, and it was because I was so into World War II and, watching movies like To Hell and Back with Audie Murphy and stuff like that my dad kind of wanted me to get like a taste of what real war was somewhat like. And Saving Private Ryan is about as close as you can get with a movie.
That's a graphic movie. Yeah.
For sure.
I remember first seeing that and being a little traumatized at the beach,
for sure,
thinking like, holy shit, that's probably what that was really like. And I think they did a great job recreating.
They did a fantastic job. And what they particularly did such a good, Steven Spielberg, what he did such a particularly good job with is putting little stories, here and there where it's like, you have like the Tom Hanks storyline and stuff like that, but especially there on Omaha Beach, it's like, it's him and you're like seeing what he's seeing.
Yeah.
And like he's going and he's seeing that guy that is looking around for his arm, and then he picks his arm up off the beach and starts running with it. Like that was a true story. The guy was trying to get his watch off of his arm.
Really?
Yeah. That is a story that happened in several different places, not just Omaha Beach. But I know at least 2 original stories of guys where they got their arms blown off or shot off. And they're like, hey, like get my wristwatch off my arm.
Wow.
So it's like putting those little stories in there and like kind of tipping the hat to other units that were there, like the Navy Beach Battalion. Like there's a part in that, and, you know, probably 5 or 6 minutes into the beach, and, you know, Tom Hanks is trying to help his executive officer who's been wounded, and he's talking to a guy, and he's like, no, I'm Navy Beach Battalion. I'm in charge here, not you, even though he was probably an enlisted guy.
Yeah.
I don't remember seeing a rank on him, but he's like, nope, Captain, I'm in charge here. Like, I'm saying this one's going because we need to make holes for the tank. So it's like kind of like tipping the hat to them and the 29th Infantry and the other guys that were on the beach that they did such a good job with.
Yeah, it goes to show some of the research that they obviously did. And as an expert on it, is Saving Private Ryan still one of your favorites?
Oh, for sure.
Was there anything that like you kind of lost? You're like, damn it, this movie's so mad. I can't even enjoy it anymore.
No, not
good.
particularly, because I think that's for a couple reasons. One, they did a really good job.
They did.
They didn't do a perfect job, but that's just the movies.
Sure.
And you know, people will complain all the time about like, oh, like Saving Private Ryan, or this detail is wrong, or, you know, they got the passwords backwards. You know, whenever they start meeting up with the paratroopers, they're calling out Thunder, and the other guy calling out Flash, it's backwards.
Yep.
So it's like, you know, little details like that. And Captain Dale Dye, who was the military advisor for that movie, who got his start with Platoon. Like he was the one, like after Platoon came out, they're like, we want the guy who, you know, made Platoon look like Platoon, you know, made actors
that was a different
look like
war,
soldiers. Oh, totally. But like he went and did, you know, Band of Brothers and Saving Private Ryan. He did Alexander the Great. Like he's done all.
So just a general military advisor.
So he did an excellent job, and all of his stuff always has been.
Yeah.
But like, you know, little bits of, you know, his experience in Vietnam, because he was in Vietnam. That's why him and Oliver Stone, you know, got along so well for Platoon, is because they were both Vietnam vets. You know, and like making that Vietnam movie. But like, you know, little bits, you know, whether it be a hand signal or whether it be a bit of terminology, kind of sneaks its way in there. Not that it takes away from anything, but it's like, oh, like you see it, or you hear it or whatever. And that just is
it gives
what
it some authenticity. I feel like once you notice, and if you have an eye to look for things, you notice those things a lot more, and it makes the movie a lot better.
For sure.
It sucks. I don't like to watch a lot of Iraqi war movies because most of the time they just piss me off, right? I'm like, that's dumb as shit. Nobody ever did that.
Exactly.
And so it ruins the movie for me.
It's like, oh, like you never wear that piece of kit here, or you know, that's always, you always put that on your back, or
and they make movies
they
like,
didn't even have those
like
radios.
Hurt Locker, right? Where like the EOD guy is Rambo and just saves the whole war and has all these skill sets outside of his actual skill set.
For sure.
And they just get painful.
So like movies like Saving Private Ryan and Band of Brothers, they're not ruined for me. You know, I can watch them and I can, you know, point out things here and there or whatever. More what I like to do is, you know, whenever I talk to civilians or whenever I talk to even military people, you know, we always kind of use that as a baseline. And that's what I thought that those movies, especially Saving Private Ryan, were good for. Yes, was it a perfect movie? No, in terms of historical authenticity. Yeah. But what that movie did was more than almost anybody else has ever done in terms of getting people interested in World War II, because after that, everyone wanted to know about it. And the more important thing is that's what got vets talking about it. Vets did not talk about World War II before Saving Private Ryan. Hardly. There were some exceptions, and, you know, some that had wrote books like Don Burgett, who was in 1st Battalion of the 506 of the 101st. You know, he wrote his books, and, you know, George Koskomaki, you know, he was the radio operator for General Taylor. So he was the commanding officer of the 101st. And so he got letters and he spoke to all other guys that he served with, and he compiled 3 books that are fantastic.
Wow.
D-Day with the Screaming Eagles, Hell's Highway, and I think the last one was called Seven Roads to Hell. I could be mistaken on the third book, but it was about Bastogne. But it's like there were vets that were, writing to other vets and telling and sharing their experiences, and then he compiled them into a really well-organized series of books that kind of goes into those details. But other than that, World War II vets didn't talk about it, unless they were being interviewed by the History Channel or something like that. They didn't talk about it, but that's what got other people interested, and it's what got their kids interested. And it's like, oh, I didn't know that you were on Omaha Beach. I didn't know that you served with the 101st Airborne.
Do you feel like you spend a lot of time educating people about just the basic information of the war, or do
I do? Especially the youth. I went and I spoke for probably 150 or 200 high schoolers. So I'll go around and talk to schools and colleges and, doing lectures and things like that. And I'll bring World War II equipment and artifacts and stuff and weapons and things like that to, in places where it's, appropriate and safe and all that kind of stuff.
This is dummies. A machine gun, kids.
Bringing dummy stuff and all that kind of stuff.
So the kid all in black's like, where can I get one of those?
and I probably did my last one probably about 3 months ago. And again, about 150, 200 kids. And I'm like, okay, who's seen Saving Private Ryan or Band of Brothers? So I have like a baseline, out of 150, 200 kids.
How old are these kids?
Well, they're high schoolers. Okay. And it's like, especially in these days, kids playing Call of Duty and all that kind of stuff. It's more or less the same thing, just with real people.
Like stealing cars and killing hookers. It's okay if you watch Band of Brothers.
Yeah, exactly. And like out of 150, 200 kids, only like I could count on one hand how many of them had actually seen it. So they just had zero understanding about what I was talking about. And so like I, would try and give them, a better understanding and try and create a baseline, but it was tough. It was super tough.
So what's the hook? So how do you get kids to be interested in probably the darkest era of the 19th century, in at least one of them, right? And how do you explain it to where they could see themselves as Germans and not only as the Jews? Like, that's the important thing, right? We've got to get people to remember how they were able to do that shit so we don't redo that shit.
Yeah, so in trying to... In some ways, it's kind of easier given the political environment if their eyes are open to it.
Okay.
People can kind of understand like, hey, like this is what manipulation looks like on a political scale.
Yeah.
But even then, it's very different because the truth can be so hidden today. And there's so much more volume of disinformation. In World War II, there wasn't television.
Right.
If they went to the movies, they would have little quick, newsreel type things, that are giving updates on the war, talking about this or talking about that. I mean, that's how a lot of American paratroopers found out about the paratroopers.
Yeah.
They went to the movies and they were like, oh, like that's pretty cool.
$100 a month
like,
extra.
To hell with that. Yeah. I'll talk about some of those kind of stories, and someone would be like, "Oh, yep, nope, not going to do that." But then whenever they hear about the extra pay, they sign up for it, and things like that. But all there was newspapers and word of mouth and so forth back then. So, it's a kind of a totally different landscape that we're looking at today, and that we're constantly being fed. Every time a kid pulls up YouTube or pulls up Facebook or whatever, they're seeing some type of political ad or
it's
whatever.
Unavoidable.
That's completely unavoidable. And it's how do you understand the truth?
Yeah. How do you tie this back into history with hopefully a lesson that saves us from recreating it? Exactly. What do you find that they get the most interest in?
So kind of the icebreakers, what is kind of the hook was the word that you used a minute ago, is like the equipment and the uniforms and stuff like that. Like whenever you walk into a classroom and you see like fully kitted out mannequins, or you see me dressed up in, these uniforms, that's obviously a military uniform, but it's not camouflage, so it's not a modern day uniform. And you see all these, artifacts and things like that. Like that is a real hook that brings people in.
That's cool.
And like even on, YouTube and stuff like that, people are very apt to click on one of my videos that's having to do with something with gear because it's so different than what they see today. And they see it in the movies and they want to understand what it is. So that's kind of like a foot in the door. And then probably the second thing is making the war more of a human experience than a tactical one. Like I will, talk about the battles and talk about them from a macro scale, from a map perspective, so to speak, and showing like, oh, these guys were here, and, mention the commanding officers or whomever. But then I bring it down to the individual stories, the individual, Tom and Chuck stories of like these like, Yankees or these kids from the South or, whatever going in and jumping into Normandy. And all of a sudden they're all by themselves and they're faced with, do I go this way or do I go this way? Do I shoot this guy or do I not shoot this guy? It's all those stories that bring it down to a very human experience. Oh, I lost my best friend. And then also pointing out that they're the same age because, all these kids fighting in World War II, they were 17, 18, 19 years old. I believe that it was either 18 or 19 was the average age. So that's the average. So you obviously have ones that are older than that, but then you have a lot that are younger than that too. There was a Marine, forgive me, I wish that I recalled his name off the top of my head. I believe that he got his Medal of Honor on Iwo Jima, and the action that took place for him to be up for the Medal of Honor, I believe he was 16. Like he lied about his age and all this kind of stuff. And he might've been 17. And then by the time he got the medal, he was 18, if I remember right.
That's an amazing detail of that war because I don't think you could get much of anyone to sign up these days. Right. But kids were lying there over their age and some even committing suicide because they couldn't serve. They were the ones that were left behind and they were ashamed. Yeah. Right. We've definitely digressed from that quite a bit, but our country's track record for why we've been going to war ain't great either. Yeah. Right. So I get it.
Yeah. There's a disillusionment for sure.
Sure. I mean, I feel that way. I wouldn't want my kid to do anything or like, I would want to vet any conflict that came up again myself too. That? Like,
you sure about that?
Weapons of mass. I've heard that before, and so I don't blame them, but it's a different time.
And it's also, they were different people. I mean, like if you look at all these guys that were fighting in World War II, they were Depression kids. Yeah. Like they were like, one of the things I always point out to people is they were so much smaller back then. And the reason why they were smaller is because they were malnourished, because they couldn't afford milk and eggs and all this kind of stuff on a regular basis. So that's why you see all these, World War II guys being like 5'6", 5'7", 5'8", anything over 5'9", like you were kind of a giant.
Yeah.
Like there were a couple paratroopers that were, over 6 foot and they were huge. Whereas today it's like, oh, that's, regular sized guy.
Those guys own dairy farms.
Yeah, exactly. From good breeding stock. But yeah, like, so they grew up having to fend for their families. Yeah. I'll kind of segue into Dan McBride's story here a little bit. Dan McBride, he was Fox Company, the 502nd. He joined up on April 9th, which was his 18th birthday of 1942. So it was, Pearl Harbor happened. And then so many guys signed up immediately after Pearl Harbor. The earliest he could sign up because his parents wouldn't sign off on it was his 18th birthday. So he signed up on that day. But in growing up through the Depression and stuff like that, he grew up in Ohio, not too far from a place called Conneaut, which is literally like a mile from where his house is where the largest reenactment in the United States takes place, which is called Conneaut, Ohio, or Conneaut D-Day. And it's a huge D-Day reenactment. They have paratroopers and infantry. They actually do like a beach, landing using, three or four Higgins boats. They actually go out on, I think it's Lake Erie, and they actually like do a beach landing for the public. And literally, if you walk a mile down the beach, is Dan McBride's house from whenever he was a kid.
That would be cool to see.
He was up on top of the roof helping fix shingles or doing whatever. Whenever his family first heard about Pearl Harbor, him and his dad are up on the roof, and his mom is inside, and she's like, you guys have to hear this. And like literally, like she either turned up the radio really loud and like opened up the window for them to actually hear what was going on there, like sitting up on top of the roof, listening to what happened at Pearl Harbor. Wow. And whenever he would walk to school, whenever he was in middle school or high school or whatever, they couldn't afford a whole lot of food and so forth. So he would take his 22 with him, and he would be hunting rabbits to and from school. And that's what they would be eating for dinner that night. And, the pay that, his dad and or his mom brought in, was paying for their other living expenses. But it was like they all had to grow up so much earlier.
Yeah. Children did grow up a lot earlier, and there's almost this misconception that we need to keep our kids mm-hmm. and not let them grow up until they're, 20 or something. And yeah, children did far more at way sooner than we expect of kids these days. Yeah. I don't know that that's a good thing, that we're letting them just frolic through life until they're 18.
I think that there's definitely we have to protect childhood, especially boyhood, because boys are kind of forced to grow up faster than girls more often, even in today's standards, I think, and we do have to protect that boyhood to an extent. Like, you need to be a kid. Yeah. I feel like in World War II, those guys grew up way earlier than they had to, or than they should have. It helped the country. I'm not saying that it was a bad thing, but in terms of personal development, I think that it is better for them. But then at the same time, you do need to grow up, and you do need to learn how to be a man, and you do need to, fend for your family and provide for your family. A lot of guys were going out and they were becoming a part of the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was a government-run organization. And in fact, a lot of guys on the leadership side of it, especially the team leaders or, whatever they were called, were prior military, World War I veterans and stuff like that. And they were going out and they were building highways and they were doing all this stuff. And it was a place where these young kids could come and start earning a living for their family. Their parents couldn't afford to keep them at home. So they joined the CCC, and they would go around the country building highways or building railroads or doing any and all these random
domestic military service.
Basically, and they ran it very much like the military, where it's just this is your squad, or I don't know if they called them a squad, but it was there was a chain of command, and they learned all that stuff. So they were somewhat indoctrinated isn't the right word, but they were used to and or understood what it was like to be a part of a team, mm-hmm. And the importance of that, which was something that really paid off in the actual war and them being successful in that.
Yeah, I think boys also we don't really have a tangible transition point from boyhood to manhood. Mm-hmm. Girls, you have a baby, you're a woman, you're a mom, your life changed a whole lot.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have as strong of an immediate effect on us, right? I just had a kid. I'm looking at him I don't feel any different yet, but I know it's coming, right? Yeah. I'm learning these things, but for her, it's tangible.
Yeah.
And we don't have that. And I think that we need something. And I agree. I don't know what it is, but I agree we need something.
John Eldredge has a couple good books out about that. One in particular that's one of my favorites that I kind of try and lean towards, one, raising my boys that way, but then also kind of looking at my own story and my own life through it. And it's okay, where did I get, what stage did I get stuck in, or what stage did I get pushed through quicker than I should have, or whatever. It's called Fathered by God, I believe is the name of the book.
Okay.
But it's very much talking about, and that was one of the reasons why I said boyhood has to be protected, because there's a purpose for that phase. There's a purpose for, the boyhood phase, the cowboy phase, the warrior phase. And they're kind of individual defining points between the two. So give that a look.
I will. That's very interesting that there's a cowboy phase, there's a warrior, because I've seen my kid kind of go through those.
Yeah.
A lot of it's whatever he's watching that week.
Yeah.
Well, After Lonesome Dove was the cowboy phase.
For sure.
But yeah, I'd be real curious to learn more about what aspects of each phase are important and why, and how to foster that. That's super interesting. You have 2 boys, right?
2. Yeah. 6 and 4.
Yeah. That's awesome. How has fatherhood been for you?
Difficult.
Yeah.
Difficult, especially in the younger years, before they can communicate and before they can reason, is very difficult for me, because I want to get down on their level and I want to explain things, but I want to explain things. And if, whenever they were too young to understand an explanation, even whenever I would, simplify it as best as I could, it was difficult.
Yeah.
And it's something that, as they get older, I feel like I can become a better father, but it's something that I'm continually working on, because I want to be a good father for them. I want to be, the foundation that they build the rest of their life on, in me and my walk with God and so forth, and raising them up to be men of God, I think is incredibly important. It's something that I'm continually striving towards, and something that I have to try and be gracious towards myself for, because I'm not the best father at sometimes.
Yeah, I feel that. Being reactionary is the hardest. Like, sometimes I want to explain it so he understands, and I don't just go to, okay, you did the thing, here's the punishment.
Yeah.
Because then there's not really an understanding. I want the understanding to be there.
Yeah, those teaching moments.
And you're right, it's super hard when the capacity for that understanding doesn't exist yet. It's like right around 6, it's almost like there's a consciousness that just sort of enters his body, and now he can think and talk, and like, oh, we have the logical reasoning gene or part of his brain starting to develop. And it's funny because my kid calls me out all the time. The other day we were talking about, he was doing something and he wasn't playing nice with his friends, and I was like, yeah, the next time you're just going to sit on the bench and watch them swim because you can't participate. And he's like, well, if you don't let me participate, then how will you know if I'm improving? So you have to let me swim so that I can show you that I can behave myself. Otherwise, I'm just sitting on the side and we're not making any progress. And I'm like, I'm seeing where he's going, and I'm like, this motherfucker. And I look, and my wife is standing behind him, and I just see her head slowly turning around and looking at me, and I'm
like,
trying to keep
you.
Yes,
He got you
1,000%. I'm just like, well, my hope is that you will want to play with them and alter your behavior so that you can. I'm just like, God damn it. But yeah, it's like the lights start to come on, and I don't know, can I then assume that I'm able to explain things?
Part of that is, in coming into that kind of kindergarten years. Mm-hmm. So, that 5 to 6, 6 to 7 transition, is they're starting to kind of have more self-awareness. And they're trying to build their own independence. That's kind of, if I'm remembering John Eldridge's book right, that's kind of going into like the cowboy phase. That might still be boyhood, but I digress. But it's, they're trying to flex their muscles a little bit. They're trying to make room for themselves in the family. And that also comes with like some humility on the part of the mom and the dad, of like, okay, we need to let him. Yeah. We need to let him, like, don't let him be disrespectful and all that kind of stuff. Like there's lines and so forth, but it's like, okay, we had him figured out, before he turned 5 or before he turned 6. But now he is going into something different, and it's a very natural thing for them. It's not unnatural. It's uncomfortable for us, but it's a very natural step and a very natural progression for them. And it's like, okay, we need to rework our parenting and figure out like, okay, how can we give him more leash? Yeah. Cause it's like, you still protect him, he's still under your wing, so to speak, but it's like, okay, step out from under the wing for a couple minutes.
It's hard. Like,
it's so hard.
it would be so much easier to just like whoop him and demand obedience.
Yeah.
But that's not the person I want him to be.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I don't want him to take the vaccine because someone told him. I want him to ask the question, right? But it's super inconvenient when I'm the one telling him and he asks the question. I'm like, dude, just do what I'm telling you to do, and we won't have to worry about it.
Exactly. I struggle with that all the time. And the thing is it's the importance, especially that we see in American culture that we don't see in other cultures, like in North Korea and stuff like that, of like the importance of the individual. Not that it's like, the snowflake and, like all that nonsense that's being taught today and so forth, but it's the idea that the individual is important.
Yeah.
And individual initiative is important.
Yeah.
Like that was one of the things that was particularly apparent in, like that was one of the things that was recognized by a lieutenant in the 501st. So the 101st Airborne, you have the 501st, the 502nd, 506 regiments, and then you have the three battalions underneath them, and then you have like the medical companies and 377th Field Artillery Battalion and all that kind of stuff. So he was in the 501st, and he recognized that on the tactical level, the 501st didn't know all that much. One of the commanders of the 501st, Lieutenant Colonel Ewell, he took over whenever Colonel Johnson was killed in Holland, and he said himself, like, we could write down what we knew about tactics on a postage stamp, very little bit. It was basically like Battle Drill 1 Alpha, but it was all the importance of the individual and individual initiative of knowing like, hey, we need to do this, we need to cover this, and it's all that lower level of troops, that they could be on the squad level, the platoon level, where it comes to their platoon leaders and senior platoon leaders, company commanders and stuff like that, recognizing, oh, we have to cover this bridge, we have to cover this hill, all this kind of stuff, and people understanding that they have a role to play in that, and that they need to have personal initiative, because if they just wait for orders, people are going to get killed.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why I believe that the Russian military right now, they don't really have an NCO corps. Like it's literally just enlisted and officers. I could be totally mistaken about that. I'm not a, Russian military historian or anything like that. But that's one of the issues that they see in the war in Ukraine, is that lack of personal initiative. There's initiative whenever it comes to, individual survival, but it doesn't go much further than that. And that's one of the things in Western society that like we recognize the importance of the individual.
Yeah, I'd say that's a cultural thing that is, I don't know if it's completely unique to us, but there's parts of the world that don't have that for sure. There's a lot where there's not agency. You're a cog.
Yeah.
Right. And
it's by no means unique to the United States, but it is an important thing.
Yeah.
It's not something like, oh, like America's getting this wrong for sure. Like that whole thing about the individual. No, like it is something that is recognized as something that is very important.
Do you think that, I could see a lot of that in our troops, the individual, and the opposite in the Japanese troops.
Yeah.
Where would you say the Germans fall in that?
The Germans were extremely tactically proficient.
Yeah.
And they did really have, and they had an NCO corps and stuff like that. So they did really well. They might have suffered more than the United States. If they were in any individual engagement, they might have suffered more whenever they lost their officers. But it was nowhere near what like the Japanese were.
Yeah.
The Japanese, it was all about the officers. They had an NCO corps too. But the officers were the main driving force in that.
I mean, I say that, but do you remember the story of the Japanese soldier in the Philippines who continued until 1974?
Oh, yeah.
When he demanded that his commanding officer tell him that they surrendered?
Yeah.
Dude's in the jungle for like 30 years, just fucking shit up.
Yeah.
Hardcore.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, how long do you
True
think,
believer.
how long do you think our platoon of our guys would make it if they stopped sending MREs?
Oh, man.
Like, this dude's on it. You're like, man, I really got to ration my ammo. I've got 30 years to go here.
Yeah.
One bandolier.
Seriously.
Golly.
Between that and food, like, oh, you get this much rice.
And, maybe that is the testament to the lack of the individual, where he was, at no point was he like, fuck this.
Yeah.
These guys ain't coming back. I'm just going to hang out and build a tiki hut.
Yeah.
He stayed true to the mission. I mean, that's hardcore commitment.
Yeah, that's Bushido.
Bushido, yeah.
Bushido code.
Is that what that is?
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah, the whole, kind of death before dishonor type mentality. And, whenever they would, lose a battle, they would commit seppuku.
Yeah.
Harry Carey as GIs called it, but seppuku.
Didn't the leader of the Japanese army on Iwo Jima do that?
Oh, yeah.
Committed suicide with his sword.
Yeah, pretty much all of them. I don't know of any high-ranking, whether they be Japanese army or Japanese navy. Like Shibasaki, I believe his name, Admiral Shibasaki. He was the commander of all the Japanese troops on Tarawa. Which was, they were all Rikusentai, which was Royal Marines. So they were technically Navy. So I don't know of any high-ranking Navy or Army officers that were in field engagements that ever walked off that field, as a POW or otherwise. They either won or they died.
It's a hardcore
whether they died in combat or whether they committed, ceremonial suicide. Have
you gone down the rabbit hole on some of the experimentation, like Unit 751, stuff like that?
Not a whole lot. An interesting, one of the few areas where I've looked into a little bit is, about frequency wars. And it was how, and don't take any of this for gospel, like go and look it up for yourself. But it was basically in the years prior to World War II, there was a lot of research going on in the United States that I believe was funded by the Rockefellers, that was looking into frequencies and the importance of frequencies, and like what frequencies, cause people to do certain things. This frequency, causes people to be more agitated. This frequency, causes people to be more submissive.
So the
all
effects of sound.
The effects of sound and the effects of frequency on the human brain. And
what'd they figure out?
And where'd all that stuff go? Germany. It went to Goebbels. All that research was either given or purchased. And there was this huge thing where even in this was on like the music, like on the artist level, they had like this huge propaganda thing going on where they wanted to change the tuning of A to a different frequency. And don't hold me to the frequency. I don't know it off the top of my head, but it was literally just like changing it just a little bit. I think 442 is like the proper tuning of an A.
Okay.
And then it was literally like 447 or something like that. It was only off by a few hertz.
Yeah. Wow.
But it was this whole thing, and they had like a convention basically where like all of Europe were going to like vote on this. And the Nazis did this whole thing where they, would send out invitations and they would like put out their feelers like, hey, are you for the changing of the tuning of A? And they'd be like,
purpose?
Yes, no, all this kind of stuff. And the guys that said no, they weren't for it. They were disinvited from this convention or whatever in Paris. And so they switched it. They had this convention, they switched it. And the changing of that frequency made it so that people were more agitated, made it so that people were more submissive, that were more apt to do what they were told. And every time the Germans would go into a foreign country, like Poland or wherever, they would go to the local radio stations and they would change the frequency.
That's wild.
To that other thing, to just add in that extra level of
annoyance,
unrest throughout the countries where it's like, they'd flip on, just be listening to music. They wouldn't even be listening to propaganda, but they would be getting those things into their brain. I can't speak to the science of all that, but the little bit of research that I've done, like, it's a very real thing.
Like, imagine if someone went into Pornhub and changed all the moaning to like Japanese girls. Just ruined it for everyone. Yeah, that's messed up. That's wild, man. So what are some other like just wild facts that you've learned from studying the war?
Oh,
or maybe just one of their favorite things to tell people. Because that's an unusual factoid.
Gosh, that's hard.
There's a lot of them.
Yeah,
from that war.
There are so many. Most of the things that I like to talk about are, the individual story levels. It's not even big picture stuff.
Well, let's jump into some of the people. You said Dan McBride, right? And we talked about him. What else about his story, or do you want to kind of segue off of him?
Yeah, so we'll kind of start with Dan. So, Dan, I believe he was on a date, and he took a girl to the movies.
Nice.
And this, little newsreel footage popped up and so forth, talking about, the new airborne corps that was coming out, because parachuting was like a brand new military concept. The Germans, well, actually, technically the Russians were the first ones to really come up with a paratrooper corps, to my knowledge. And they did like a big demonstration jump of like thousands of jumpers for the Nazi high command back whenever they were allies, before the war broke out. And the Germans saw that and they were like, yep, we're going to take that. And so they came up with the Fallschirmjäger Corps. So Fallschirmjäger is sky hunter is what that translates to. And so they came up with that, and then they employed them to great success on the island of Crete, off of Greece. And it was successful, but it came at a very, very, very high cost. They took around 30% casualties, and of those 30% casualties, 50% of those were KIA. So that's a really high, usually the wounded are way higher than your KIA. And so like they got torn up really bad. It was the 3rd Fallschirmjäger that jumped into Crete. And they went through and did that. And Hitler was like, hey, I'm really glad that we did that. Good job, Luftwaffe. The German Air Force. They were the ones that fathered the paratrooper corps, and they're like, "Hey, great job, but we're never doing that again." And so there were never any more, high level, mass drops of paratroopers. The Germans did use paratroopers for, behind the scene, special operations type stuff, and like the recapturing of, or the rescue of Mussolini, and, various things like that. But there was never anything beyond like a battalion that was ever deployed as paratroops. But the United States saw the invasion of Crete and how successful it was. And they're like, okay, we're going to start our own airborne corps. And so they started doing that.
So the same war, the Germans conducted it, and they're like, oh, we're done. We ain't doing that again.
Yeah.
And we watched, and they're like, oh yeah, we can throw bodies at that.
Exactly. The Allies, the British, Americans, and Canadians all recognize, like, okay, airborne is like the way of the future.
Did they just tweak the parachutes to make it better, or what was the issue?
To an extent. So one of the problems with the German parachutes is that they only have one connection. So like, you look at an American parachute, you've got the 4 risers coming off of your harness.
Yeah.
And off those 4 risers, is where all your suspension lines are coming out of. But for the German parachutes, like 2 straps came up off the back, and they went to like a single connector that was like a little bit over the head. And so like, if you watch German paratroopers, they have no control. They're literally like spinning, like as they come down. And then the way that they do their PLF is it's kind of like a forward somersault. Like it is a nasty thing to watch.
I wouldn't want to do that either.
And so there was, jump casualties and so forth, but it was more, casualties from combat that was like, okay, that's why we're never doing that again. But the United States and the British and the Canadians, the parachutes that they were using are not too dissimilar from what we're using now. We're on the T11 right now, and what we were using for decades was the T10, and that's what I jumped with the World War II Airborne Demonstration Team. But for World War II, they were at the T5. So like the T is like, so there was like the T1, the T2 to T3, so it got, by the time that we were actually employing troops, it was the T5.
Okay.
And so, and that is almost the exact same thing as a T10. Like there's very little difference between the two parachutes, and it's really more the differences in the harness and in the types of buckles that they were using.
Just a couple of T's.
Yeah. So they started using, those parachutes, and they started to initiate that, and guys started to get word of it. And, there were definitely guys that were just like, yeah, I want to be with the best of the best, the guys that you see, that are, in the special operations communities, like they want to be the best of the best of the best kind of a thing. And some of those guys, that was what their intent was. But with other guys, they were literally just, after the extra pay, they'd go through and, in the recruiting offices and so forth, they're like, hey, who wants to do, Navy and all this kind of stuff? And they're like, who wants to join the paratroopers? And they're like, what the heck is a paratrooper? I have no idea. Shoot, aircraft. Most of these guys had never even been on a plane.
Yeah.
I'm not sure when the first commercial flight was. I'm sure it wasn't until like the 30s or so, but, flight in general was less than like 40 years old. I can't remember when the Wright brothers flew, but it was a very new thing. And so they're like, oh, like, a paratrooper is like these guys that jump out of airplanes with a parachute, and everyone's like, to heck with that, talk to you later. But they're like, oh, but you get paid $50 a month more.
I knew it was 50 or 100.
And they're like, okay.
Yeah.
And so like the $50 a month was, their base pay, and they get $50 jump pay.
Yeah.
And so like a lot of guys would be like, okay, yeah, I'm signing up for that. And that's kind of one of the things that was, kind of changed from Band of Brothers that they talk about. There's a scene when Dick Winters, the main character, is driving around and he's talking to one of his senior platoon leaders, and he's saying like, oh, these guys joined the paratroopers because they wanted to be the best. They didn't want to end up with some draftee who was going to get them killed. There were a ton of draftees in the paratroopers.
Really?
Oh yeah, there was a ton of them. Paratroopers was an all volunteer group or an all volunteer service. So like they had to volunteer to do that. Like the wording on the contract was basically like, I knowingly volunteer to, make 5 jumps out of a perfectly good airplane kind of a thing. Like they knew exactly what they were getting into. But, a lot of those guys were draftees. A lot of them were, guys that went up and signed up right after Pearl Harbor as well. But there were a ton of draftees who were amazing soldiers. Like they try and, paint with a little bit of a broad brush about like, oh, draftees are not no good.
Do you think that's more of a Vietnam carryover? Because I thought they had a pretty negative persona in the Vietnam War.
And talking about the years in between World War II and Vietnam, you're talking about a major cultural shift.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of change and so forth in there, and that's where, draftees get, a real bad name.
Mm-hmm.
But granted, even in Vietnam, there were draftees that still ended up being great soldiers or great Marines or whatever. But, that is one thing in Band of Brothers that, is like a tweak that I like to, correct people on, or like point out to people like, hey, like,
lots of
draftees meant nothing.
Yeah.
Like they were all volunteers.
Okay.
It's just some of those volunteers were draftees and some of them were volunteers of volunteers, so to speak.
Right.
And so, a lot of those guys were signing up for that. And, parachuting was a dangerous thing. Flying in a plane was a dangerous thing. Don Burgett, who was in 1st Battalion of the 506th, he went off and he wrote 3 books after the war. About his personal memoirs, his personal experiences. Amazing books, incredible detail. And he wrote about, for his first jump, he went up and he jumped, and whenever he came down, he started to bicycle. He was like reaching for the ground with his feet. And like there's a guy on the ground with a bullhorn in a Jeep, and he's like, stop bicycling. And he goes down and he hits the ground, and he messed up one of his legs. Not super bad. It was just a minor fracture. But like he hits the ground and he can't stand. and it takes everything in him to just get his parachute off. And then he starts literally crawling to the collection point.
Jeez.
And that same Jeep comes over and he's like, hey, where's your parachute? And he's like, it's back that way. And he's like, go get it and go to the collection point. And long and short, he goes back to the hospital. They x-ray. They're like, oh, it's just a minor fracture. And he's like, well, can I get some crushes? And they're like, no, there are guys with worse breaks. You don't get any crushes. And so he like went out to a tree and he cut off a tree branch. So he had like a little makeshift crutch. And he went back to his barracks. And so like all the other guys, like they just had their first jump and they're going off and completing all their other jumps. And I believe it was over 5 days. They were supposed to do PT and, train in the morning and then make a jump in every afternoon. Well, it came down to the last day and they were supposed to make 2 jumps, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. And so he, says goodbye to him, like, good luck, all that kind of stuff. They all go out. And then he goes down and he takes a nap in the barracks. And then he wakes up. He doesn't know how long he was out for, but he starts hearing like all these guys partying and hooping and hollering and stuff like that outside of his barracks. Everybody had come back from their 5th jump. And they were, they had, hid beer and booze throughout the barracks and stuff like that. So they were living large. But nobody is in his barracks. And so he goes to one of the next door barracks and he's talking with the guys. He's like, hey, where are the guys from my hut? And they're like, oh, you didn't hear? And he's like, no, what? And he's like, their plane went down. They're all dead.
Oh, shit.
So like, because he had hurt his leg, he would have been on that plane with the rest of them, but they went up and they were at jump altitude. So they were only at 1,000 feet AGL. And the pilot goes to throttle back so that they can, perform their jump. And whenever he does that, I believe it was the right engine just totally went shot and the plane went in. So it's like, that was happening all the time.
It's such a tragedy. And that's the things like that, I think, fuck with people a lot. Like getting killed in combat, getting killed by the enemy, stuff like you expect that. You expect that. That's a possibility.
Yeah.
Dying over some dumb shit and training.
Seriously.
You just don't even. You don't think it's going to happen.
No.
No one does, but it does a lot.
No.
And it's really sad that shit happens.
Yeah, so he went up and, a few months later, he healed up and, got his jumps, and then he went and joined, I believe it was Able Company, 506, and jumped into Normandy and continued through the war. And we'll talk a little bit more about him a little later. But there was a group of Canadians that came down to Benning. It was Benning, to TPS, the parachute school, is what they called it. And so they came down to TPS to get their, jump training, to get their wings and stuff like that. And this American lieutenant, I believe he was their instructor. And like literally like first day, he goes out there and he's like, watch me, I'm going to put on this parachute and you're going to watch me go and make this jump. And they're literally like right there on the air, it's a grass airfield. And he goes, puts his chute on, goes, jumps, literally comes down right in front of him, packs up his parachute, brings it over to him. He's like, see, this is totally safe. Now I'm going to show you how to pack this parachute. I'm going to do the exact same thing. So he packs up the parachute, goes up, jumps. Well, he didn't realize that it was a problem that whenever he landed in the grass was all covered in dew and his chute was all wet. And silk and nylon do not inflate whenever they're wet. At the time, it was probably silk. They transitioned to nylon later in the war. And so he goes up and he jumps and he burns in right there in front of everybody.
Wow.
Like literally these guys' first day in jump school. So it's like accidents like that were happening all the time.
How many do you think stood up and were like, nope, I'm out?
I mean, the paratroopers had at least 50% washout, but that was from training and jumps.
Yeah. Training and watching jumps.
Yeah, seriously.
God.
And so like they went out, and there was a kind of a funny story. There was an officer in the 101st who went up, and every time he would jump, he would pull his reserve chute, even whenever he didn't need to. Like he looks up, he's got a full canopy, and pops his reserve every single time. Well, the riggers got tired of repacking this reserve, so on one of his jumps, they took his reserve and they took the chute out of it and they just filled it full of sawdust.
Oh shit!
And so he jumps and pop me, and this huge cloud of dust comes away from him. Lucky his mane open.
Yeah, that's a bold prank.
Oh, I know, right? But he came to the ground, and sure enough, he never pulled his reserve ever again.
I have a friend that, man, he was a MARSOC Marine, and then he went SF, and he was jumping in South Korea. And oh man, he jumped out. The jump was fucked up, obviously. He ended up landing in an area that he wasn't supposed to land in. It was under construction. And as he's coming down, he looks down, and there's like, I don't know what it was, but it was a field full of rebar that's all sticking straight up. Sure. And a piece of rebar hit him in the taint, went straight up through his stomach and out his abdomen. And he's sitting on this giant, in this field with a piece of rebar through his gut. He has to lift himself up off of it to get off of it, to crawl out to get found, because he's the only one where he is. Nobody else is there. And then in Korea, the hospital situation's very different, right? Like, they don't take care of you so much as your family is expected to come in and feed you and bathe you and do all those things. His wife had just given birth to their first or second baby like a month prior, and had to fly from the States to South Korea, leaving the babies with her mom to feed him and care for him in the hospital until they could get him transported back to he almost died, obviously.
Yeah, no kidding.
All this infection, all this.
Yeah.
But, God, man, rebar through the taint, up your gut.
Dude.
And he's alive.
And then having like your parachute attached to you at the same time. It's like, lucky there wasn't a wind.
Oh, dude, yeah.
That thing would have ripped him in half.
Back off of it.
Yeah, gosh, if he had I wonder if as soon as he hit the ground, if he popped his cape wells so that he didn't have a parachute attached to him, because gosh, that would have been bad.
I have no idea.
I mean, it was already bad,
but
it would have been a lot worse.
Yeah, super, super bad.
Yeah, so it's like.
So had you ever jumped before you got involved with the demo team?
No, so the World War II Airborne Demonstration Team has been like, that was kind of like an altar moment, so to speak, in my life.
All right.
Because I went to the ADT whenever I was still in high school. I signed up whenever I was 17, so I wasn't even old enough to jump per the FAA, but I went and got permission to do the ground training, and then it just so happened that I turned 18 the morning that we started our jump phase. So cool. It was an incredible experience for me, and it was kind of the time where I went from being a boy to being a man, because it was like my first time away from home. Obviously, I hadn't done the military and all that kind of stuff yet, and so it was like me out there holding my own with a group of other men, and like I think the youngest guy in our jump school was probably like 29 or 30 next to me, and then there were some guys that were even older than that, so it's like I'm around a bunch of men. I don't think that anybody in our jump school in my specific class was a veteran. Several went on to become veterans in both Iraq and Afghanistan. But I don't think that at the time anybody was military. Now, the World War II Airborne Demonstration Team is full of military guys.
I would think so, yeah.
It's a ton, because one of the things that's so unique about the ADT is that it gives guys kind of the opportunity to have a very similar camaraderie that what you have in the military. In my time in the military was, nothing to write about. I never deployed or anything like, my unit never deployed, so I was never called to do that. But like going to the ADT, I have a stronger relationship with those guys than guys that I was actually in the military with. Because, with the ADT, you're parachuting. That's quasi dangerous thing to be doing. So it's like literally like you're trusting, the guy on the left and the guy on the right to know their stuff, and you're trusting them with your life. If something bad were to happen and you had to do emergency procedures on the exit out of the aircraft or whatever, you have to trust like, yep, that guy knows what he's doing. I know what I'm doing. We're going to be safe. We're in the air, whenever he's coming at me, I know that I'm going to go this way. He's going to go that way. Or if like we're inevitably going to hit, like this is how we're going to get out of that situation, how we're going to be safe. Because that's the thing with the ADT is, safety is paramount.
I think every man secretly, or maybe not secretly, but desires to be a part of a group of other men that they respect and does something a little bit dangerous.
Yeah.
Like that's the only time my attention's really there is when you tell me to do something that's a little bit dangerous.
For sure.
Like, okay, now you have we're here.
For sure.
Right. And my kid's that way. Right. If I ask him to do something that's mind-numbingly boring, I get an eye roll and a half effort.
Yeah.
But if I give him an axe and I tell him, go chop that tree down, I'm going to get a real wide look and a really? Okay. Right? Like he's going to come alive a little bit.
Yeah.
I think we're all craving that shit.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So there's a brotherhood that comes with it. And sisterhood. I mean, we have females that are a part of the ADT as well, that are very senior jumpers. Yeah. And the ADT was such a special place in my life, and going and doing that, and having that first time, away from home, even before the military. And it was, but proving to my parents, but it was more importantly, like proving to myself, like I have what it takes. Because that's what every man is seeking after, like and every young man, especially, or boy, is he wants to know that he has what it takes. Has what it takes to be a husband, be a father, to be a man, to be in the military, to do whatever. Like it's constantly that question. Like you're always looking to your dad, especially. Like, do I have enough? Am I enough? Do I have what it takes? And that was something that that question was answered for me. While I was there, because it was very difficult. Now the ADT, it is not a physical fitness, like it is not jump school in terms of like the military where you're running everywhere. And, I mean, not that modern day military.
Yeah, I don't think
modern day jump school is not
stupid.
that difficult, other than running from one place to the other.
Yeah.
Back in World War II, it was intense.
Oh, I bet.
But today, not so much. But I mean, there's not even that at ADT. Like you're not running from spot to spot. You're marching.
They're not trying
from the hangar to the
out.
PLF pit. They're not trying to do that. Like it is all about teaching you the training. And the thing is, you actually get probably the best jump training outside of the United States military, static line parachute training anyways. Because
I would argue it's even better, because most of the guys I know that went through jump training in the Army said it was total shit. Like we could have done this in 3 hours on a Sunday afternoon.
That could be because it's a 9-day jump school.
Yeah.
And that 9 days you're in a class that I think they cap it at like 20 or 25 students. And so like you have very dedicated time, and one-on-one time with the cadre of the parachute school. And so it's exceptionally in depth, and going over, emergency procedures in the aircraft. You're spending hours in the PLF pit. PLF pit in the military, there's so many guys that you're with, like you do a few and you're done.
Right.
So you get proficient at it, and then going, and we actually have the fuselage of a C-47. It was that we got out of a airplane graveyard somewhere, and we've refurbished it, and then we have it mounted up on a trailer, because as a C-47, as its tail, it's a tail dragger on the ground, the door slopes, the floor slopes upward at the door. So whenever the plane goes level, whenever it's at altitude, you have like a slight incline at the back, right where the door is. So it is a very unique circumstance trying to like turn and get yourself into a proper, body position to be able to exit the aircraft safely.
Yeah.
And so we actually have a C-47 fuselage that is up level. It's up on a trailer, and it's about 5 or 6 feet off the ground. And then we have an airbag coming off of it. And so you can actually go and put on a parachute that actually has, a real parachute inside, because the whole thing is with balance. And so like whenever you actually put on that kit, and whenever you put on your combat equipment too, is like going through and doing door exit after door exit, and you can feel like, oh, I'm tipping backwards, or I'm tipping left, or tipping right. Is like you can feel what balance looks like, and you can practice that actual push and exit out of an aircraft, because it's not like a C-17 or other military aircraft where you do like a little like bunny hop to get out the door. You literally have to push or have to pull yourself through the door and thrust yourself out of the aircraft, because if you don't, your pack tray could hit the side of the door, or your butt could hit the door on the way out. Like you need to actually have momentum going out the door, and then also trying to do that at speed. Whenever you have a stick of anywhere from 9 to 18 jumpers.
How fast are y'all going when you jump?
The aircraft, or talking about actual
airspeed?
I think it's about 150 miles per hour. I don't know that much about that side of it. How many knots or anything like that. But like it's a decent speed, and then it's a side exit. Similar to a C-17. It's not like jumping out the back of a, because I mean, shoot, that you'd have to really mess that up to have a bad body position. But yeah, so having facilities like that available to us, because the thing that's so unique about the ADT is we're the only jump team in the world that owns its own aircraft. And we have two. We have a C-17 and a C-49, which if you look at it, it's a C-47. And one of them actually saw service in Europe during the war.
Oh, wow.
The other one was stateside. So we're using the exact same jump platforms that they were back in World War II. And then also our facilities are original World War II facilities. It was a B-25 bomber base during World War II, and it's in Frederick, Oklahoma. So it's not too far from Fort Sill. And so like the whole hangar, the whole barracks area, like it is a full immersion experience where you're in there, you're wearing World War II uniforms, you're in a World War II facility for 9 days going through jump training.
Wow. Is this still open for people to be a part of ADT?
For sure.
Or how many?
We do
how
two
often
jump
do you
schools.
Take members?
We do 2 jump schools a year,
Right.
One in July and then one in October. And then we do what we call our April training event. And at the April training event, that's where, it's only open to ADT members or prior U.S. airborne.
Okay.
So regular ADT members, it's our opportunity to go back and just jump, and we don't have to be worrying about training other students or, making sure students get their jumps in before we do. It's our opportunity to do a retrain. We do a safety stand down every April. So for a whole day, we're doing nothing but retraining. And we're going over, all specific details in the aircraft and like very interesting aspects of safety that make us that much better jumpers, that make us that much better maintainers of the aircraft and so forth. But then we also do the kind of abbreviated course, or the refresher course for the guys who are prior airborne. They go through and they are basically just doing the retrain to getting used to our SOPs to be able to go and jump with us. So I believe that that's like a 3-day abbreviated course. So it's a little less expensive because you're not paying for as many days. But we have current military coming in and going through that. We have guys that, haven't jumped in 20 or 30 years that coming and, it's kind of like riding a bike and going and jumping right back into the saddle and putting their knees in the breeze.
Do y'all perform in Normandy every year? Is that your organization?
We don't go every year to Normandy, but we definitely go every 5 years. So, I jumped in the 80th anniversary, and then we just got, or excuse me, I jumped for the 75th anniversary back in 2019, and then the team just got back here this past June, obviously, for the 80th. And
you
then
didn't go on that one?
No, I wasn't able to, unfortunately. Okay. Steph is so busy with the business that I just couldn't afford time away. But they went and jumped there. They also jumped Dragoon, which is southern France, which is a few weeks after Normandy. And then at the time of this recording anyways, we're just 2 days after September 17th, which is the 80th anniversary of Operation Market Garden. So guys were going over for that as well. There was some complications with jump ops. They were only allowing X number of jumpers, period. Not just ADT guys, but like, hey, we've only got one aircraft and it can do 2 lifts. So you like very, very limited on the amount of jump slots for anybody.
How do people get picked for that then?
It's literally just signing up and going and doing it.
Really?
Yeah. So for the ADT, to jump with us, you obviously have to be a member, go through our jump school and so forth. And then whenever
How long did you say it was? 9 days?
9 days.
Okay.
9 days.
What's it cost?
I don't have that number off the top of my head, but if you go to our website, WWIIADT.org,
okay.
You can find out all that information. You can sign up for a jump course. One of the benefits of, signing up for the course, you do your deposit and all that. And once you make your deposit, if you can't make your jump school, you can just go to the next jump school. You don't lose your deposit or anything like that. And so it's giving guys the opportunity to come back and go, whenever is convenient for their schedule.
Sure. Is it all static line?
All static line. Yeah. All static line, jumping at 1,500 feet. So it's, I think military is 1,200 feet. What's that?
How long are you floating for?
Oh, it can depend on, temperature, with thermals and stuff like that, but approximately a minute and a half.
Okay.
But like from plane to the ground, if you were to drop something out of the plane at that altitude, you're about 10 to 12 seconds to the ground.
Nice.
So it's
so it
very
depends on
short
whether your
thing.
chute opens or not.
Exactly. And like, that's the thing, like in World War II, they were jumping at 1,000 feet for training jumps. And then for combat jumps, they were jumping a lot lower.
Really?
They're talking like 500 feet.
Wow. 500
feet. Because that's one of the things about the parachutes, the T5, is it's what's called a canopy first deployment system. So if you look at a World War II parachute, you look at an original photograph or something like that, you see there's like a white cord that goes around the outside of the pack. And that white cord breaks. I think it's a 20-pound break strength string. And that whole panel comes off, and then your canopy is like S-folded on your backpack, and the canopy comes out first and catches wind, and then you have all your suspension lines and your risers to reach to the bottom. So it's a very, very fast deployment system. So, everybody knows about, whenever you exit, you count to 4,000, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000. And if that, if there's no opening, you pop your reserve. Well, with a canopy first deployment system, it's more like a 2.5 second opening.
So you can jump out lower.
Oh, so you can definitely jump lower, but then also your opening shock is a nightmare. Like we kind of joke, like, if you jump canopy first, you got to make sure your boots are tied on real tight, or you're going to be barefoot by the time you hit the ground.
No shit.
Because if your canopy opens up, all of a sudden you've got, I can't remember how long a static line or a suspension lines are, 20 feet or something like that. And then you've got your risers, which are another like 4 feet or so. So it's almost like you're free falling, that 25 or 30 feet or so. So it's like a real like whip crack whenever you hit the bottom. Or those guys in World War II, what they were dealing with is that whip crack. Whereas what we jump with today is a deployment bag system. So as you fall away from the aircraft, basically the pack separates from your back and you're falling away from it, and your suspension lines and your risers are basically unwinding as you fall away, and the bag is still attached to the plane via the static line. And then after all your suspension lines come out, that's when your canopy comes out. And so it's a much smoother, it's almost more,
they're already
it's
extended.
More of a, it's more of like a swing. It's more like a violent swing with a modern day opening system.
I do remember them losing a lot of their gear from the opening, their rifles and a lot of the shit.
And that is why.
Yeah.
Because jumping with a T5 and how violent that opening is, you combine that with the excessive speeds that the pilots were traveling at on D-Day, trying to get away from the anti-aircraft and stuff like that. They were going a lot faster.
Yeah.
And so guys, whenever they were opening, it was literally equipment was just being ripped from their bodies. So like, the 506, for instance, 506 jump with leg bags. You see in Band of Brothers, they talk about, I lost my leg bag, all that kind of stuff. Well, there's a couple reasons why they lost their leg bags. And it wasn't all their fault. It wasn't all the pilot's fault. It wasn't all the jumper's fault. Like there were a bunch of different circumstances that were going in there. As part of it was, they were not trained on these bags. They literally gave these bags to them the day that they jumped, maybe a couple days before they jumped, which is, why they see
So they had no
in Band of
training,
Brothers that one guy's like, how the
practicing.
hell does this thing
Yeah.
work?
Yeah.
Like they had no idea how to jump with those things. The British had been jumping with them for a long time. They knew how that it worked, and it was a very effective system. It's actually, jumping with a leg bag is not too dissimilar than the way that modern day military jumps with a rucksack. It's, you're holding on to the bag as you exit, and then after you exit, you pull a quick release, and your ruck goes to the end of a 15-foot or 20-foot line, and it's just separating you from your equipment, so you even land just a little bit softer, and you can carry more equipment. It's not just restricted to what you can carry on your body. So these guys in the 506, and the British, you're only supposed to put about 35 or 40 pounds worth of stuff in there. And then whenever you jump, there's like a big D-ring on the top. And whenever you exit, you're actually supposed to be holding on to that. So like you use one hand to kind of guide yourself out of the aircraft, and then you're holding on to that D-ring and holding on to the bag with your right hand. And you make your exit, your chute opens, and then you let go of it, pull the quick release, and the thing comes off your leg and goes to the end of that line. Well, American paratroopers are like, oh, I can just put all my gear in there. So they're putting like 80 pounds worth of crap inside these bags, and then they don't know they're supposed to hold on to them. They just wrap the straps around the back of their legs, and they're like, we're good. And then they go and they make their exit, and they're at such excessive speeds that literally they get to the end of that whip crack, and that leg bag doesn't stand a chance. It just slides right off their foot, snaps that rope, and they're without equipment. But they were going so hard and so fast whenever their chutes opened that they had, their M42 jumpsuits, which had, 6 big pockets. It had 2 on the chest, 2 on the waist, and then 2 big cargo pockets. Well, the 82nd, whenever they were jumping those in Africa and Sicily, they realized that the M42 jumpsuit is not reinforced enough. They were losing stuff out of their pockets. The knees were blowing out just from normal use in combat. And so for Normandy, both the 82nd and 101st had their M42 jumpsuits reinforced. They would send them to... it was some group with the quartermasters, like the quartermaster salvage team or something like that. There were 2 different companies, military companies that reinforced the 2 different jumpsuits. And you see differences between the 101st and the 82nd. But they would reinforce the knees and the elbows with basically like tent canvas. It was like a treated heavy cotton canvas. But then they also reinforced the lining of the external parts of their cargo pockets on their legs as well as on their hips of their jacket. And they were going so fast that guys were getting to the ground and they reach in their pocket and there's a huge hole in their pocket from where their grenades and ammunition or whatever literally just blew out of their pocket because their opening shock was so bad.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
It'd be cool to see some of those uniforms, those one-offs.
Yeah.
I know Zero, they like to make a lot of, put in like some camouflage around,
Yeah.
they miss with a lot of their products. That'd be a cool thing to remake. They do a lot of throwback
So that's
stuff.
when I don't work with uniforms yet. I have 2 huge rolls of original M42 fabric.
Really?
And I'm just waiting for the opportunity to find the right people to go into manufacturing. And those ones, they're going to be a lot more expensive than, what reenactors would want to buy or even film productions. They would be more for, museums and stuff like that. Cause it's like, okay, this is made off of original patterns, made with original materials. Like, cause an original jumpsuit is thousands upon thousands upon thousands of dollars.
Really?
Oh yeah. Super expensive, especially if it's named. Oh yeah. If a uniform is named like to a member of the 101st or 82nd or the 17th Airborne for later in the war, price gets sky high.
No kidding.
And especially if it's a recognizable name, like somebody from Easy Company or something like that, like price is astronomical.
The market for everything, I guess.
Yeah. So yeah, like the speeds that they were jumping at, they were losing equipment left and right. A lot of guys were landing without weapons, which was obviously a nightmare because they were so, it wouldn't have been that bad had they all been together. It's like,
they're just spread out.
Give me your, your sidearm or, whatever. Or
I remember
even finding
that
wounded guys like, you broke your leg on the jump, give me your rifle kind of thing, but they're all spread out all over the place. And because they're spread out all over the place, like you're by yourself.
Totally.
Like you need to kill somebody with your bare hands to get a German to get his weapon.
They showed that in Band of Brothers, where I think we're winners, and he kind of starts to piece people together, but they're all from different units, and so this guys are supposed to take this place over here, these guys are taking this place over here, and it's like, all right, everybody forget the things that you were told to do. We're going to have to come together and just come up with a mission that we can all do together.
Exactly.
Wherever we are.
Exactly.
Right? It's a wild way.
Yeah. Yeah. And, one of the reasons why the invasion was so successful, so I kind of see the hand of providence. Like I kind of see the hand of God in what happened. So 101st and the 82nd Airbornes, they get up in their planes and they fly around the Cotentin Peninsula. You see in Band of Brothers how at the very end of episode 1, they're like flying over the fleet of ships that's underneath them, all going to Normandy, and they're going in the same direction. They weren't going in the same direction. The 101st and the 82nd, they went all the way around the Cotentin Peninsula, and they came in from behind. They did see the ships for a little bit, and guys, talked about like you could walk across from England to France without getting your feet wet almost, because there were so many ships in that armada.
That's blind.
But they did go in different directions. It was a very short period of time where they saw the ships. But anyways, they came around the Cotentin Peninsula, and they're coming in from Normandy from behind. The Pathfinder planes, the very first planes that were coming, they flew lower than everybody else because they were supposed to land about 30 minutes before everybody. And so they were literally at sea top level. Captain Lilliman, who was the commander of the 101st Pathfinders, said that there was spray from the ocean coming in the open door of the plane. They were flying that low under radar. And so Lilliman, they come in, they get around behind the Cotentin Peninsula, they jump. A lot of them misdrop and so forth. They're closer together, but they are not close to their drop zones. And so they just have to set up their Eureka beacons so that the Rebecca receivers that were on the actual aircraft could be, honed into those positions. But anyways, in that time, that 30 minutes of Lilliman and his Pathfinders coming in, and the rest of the 101st coming in right behind them, and the 82nd behind that, a fog bank came in, a huge cloud bank came in behind the Cotentin Peninsula, and the pilots couldn't see anything. They immediately began to spread out because, as you can't see anything, you're going to run into another aircraft. So they start spreading out, they start changing altitudes, all this kind of stuff, and everybody is all over the place. And then all of a sudden they start getting shot at. They break out of that cloud bank, and they almost immediately start getting shot at because Lilliman planes have already come over, so they're already kind of on alert. And so they start getting shot up. And the pilots, they'd never been in combat before, so they're yanking and banking all over the place. They're dropping their paratroopers too low. There were some instances where troopers literally, the planes are coming over, and guys that are already on the ground are watching guys come out almost at treetop level. And seeing the guys coming out and seeing and or hearing them hit the ground. They said it sounded like pumpkins being smashed on the ground from these guys coming down in their chutes, not even being close to open. And so they're spread out all over the place. Well, that ended up being a huge blessing because the Germans had no idea in what direction to launch a counterattack. So like, they're just like, there are paratroopers everywhere. Everywhere a German turned, there was a paratrooper. Yeah. So they had no concentrated place to actually
address the issue.
And send a battalion of German Fallschirmjäger, because the German 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment under Colonel von der Heydt was the main unit that was there. There were German Heer groups and so forth, regular army that were in the area, but the 6th FJ, they were like the elite unit that was in that area right behind Utah Beach, right where all the 101st and 82nd Airborne were landing. So those paratroopers were just locking horns with each other. Excuse me. Those paratroopers were locking horns with each other, from whenever they first got boots on the ground.
Yeah.
And so they go through and all these guys are being landed all over the place. But in many cases, they knew exactly where they were. It took them a little bit to get oriented. I'm not saying that they knew exactly where they were right off the ground, but they knew very, very quickly. And the reason because of that is while the troopers were in England, whenever they were activated, they're like, okay, you guys are going to go. They took them from all their places where they had been stationed around England, and they took them to all the airfields where they were going to be taking off from, the individual battalions and regiments. And they packed them into like these cigar-shaped or sausage-shaped areas that were all wrapped in barbed wire, like literally like American machine guns and stuff like that. We're watching the perimeters. Nobody goes in, nobody goes out without orders. And while they were there, they started getting mountains of information from reconnaissance photos. They were building sand tables. All the intelligence guys and so forth were getting all these and building these sand tables like to almost exact specifications. And it was so detailed that there was one group in particular that recognized that the German commander of the garrison in this particular area, he lived in this house, he rode a white horse at this time of day, every single day, and he was dating this French school teacher.
Nice.
Like they could piece together all this information, and the average airborne private knew more than a regular infantry colonel that was hitting the beach on Omaha or on Utah Beach. Like they had so much information because they had all those informations and knew everybody else's objective. They could take that personal initiative where it's like, I'm nowhere near where I'm supposed to be, but I'm near where these guys are supposed to be. And I know that this bridge is important. I know that this town is important.
How you win a war. I
know that there's an artillery battery in this area. Like I'm going to gather guys up and that's where we're closest to. That's where we're going to go. And then they'd start getting more and more people. And like, as you see in Band of Brothers, that group starts to get bigger and bigger. I thought that was a huge missed opportunity in Band of Brothers to have like a little cameo part. I totally understand, they have to do a story and they have to do all that kind of stuff and focus on guys. But Lieutenant Winters and his group of guys, they ran into Lieutenant Colonel Cole, who is the battalion commander of 3rd Battalion of the 502nd.
In real life, they did? In
real life, they did. And so they were in a group of like 80 guys. Like his little group of 15 like merged with this group of like 80, 100 guys plus, of which Colonel Cole was in charge of. And Winters like, okay, I'm going to stay with these guys until we get to this particular area, and then we're going to go south and we're going to, try to get down into exit 2, which was their primary objective. And then, he met up with, battalion headquarters, and that's when they went after the guns at Brigcorps and all that.
Yeah.
But he was with Colonel Cole, and I thought that would have been such an amazing opportunity. It was like a tip of the hat of like, they don't have to spend much time with it, but it's like, Lieutenant Winters like, hey, who's in charge here? And they're like, oh, it's it's Colonel Cole, and like showing him because Colonel Cole was the Medal of Honor recipient in Normandy. And so like it would have been like a real tip of the hat, not just to him, but also the other regiments, because there's only 2 mentions of the other regiments or you see guys of other regiments in Band of Brothers. Everybody is 506. You see one guy who's 501st in episode 3. And then you see, there's like they mention the 50 Deuce, in another episode. You don't even see them. So that would have been like a real like good nod of the hat of like, hey, there were other guys other than Easy Company. But that's what I'm there for. I'm here to like fill in the gap and, do podcasts and do presentations where it's talking about like the other guys that were there.
Right.
Because Colonel Cole, he went off and he initiated a bayonet charge, which allowed the 101st to take Carentan. And like if he hadn't have done that, that could have been a real problem because Utah and Omaha Beach are completely separate from each other. They're literally divided by the estuary of the Dews River, which is a big terrain feature. And tanks and infantry cannot link up with each other off of Utah and Omaha Beach. If you start at one and tried to walk to the other, you couldn't walk there.
Yeah.
So they needed to be able to link between the two of them. So after they took their initial objectives behind Utah Beach, whether they be the causeway exits or, other towns and so forth in that particular area, the next major objective was going to be Carentan. 101st wasn't supposed to take Carentan. They were supposed to only fight for 3 days, and then they were supposed to be taken off the line, used as shock troops and then brought back to, refit and all that kind of stuff.
That didn't happen.
No, did not happen. General Taylor, gave this big pep talk, and he's like, give me 3 days and 3 nights of hard fighting and you will be relieved kind of a thing. And here they are like, day 6 and they're like, yeah, give me 3 days.
Yeah.
And so the 101st became even more crucial than what they already were because all the troops coming in off of Utah, they were either starting to make a direct shot out of Utah, going more towards Lafayette and so forth, Lafayette Bridge and so forth, which is where the 82nd was, trying to kind of cut all the way across the Cotentin Peninsula to kind of cut off any Germans that were in that particular area, as well as they were making the huge right turn up to Cherbourg because the invasion needed a deep water port to be able to do supplies. So they needed to get up to Cherbourg as fast as possible. So all the tanks and the infantry, they're being diverted off of Utah Beach, either to the west or to the south, but they're not going to like the south and the east, which is where Carentan was. But who's there is the 101st Airborne. So basically the order of march, the 502nd were to be the first guys down that causeway. And what I mean by a causeway is the Germans knew that there was going to be paratroopers used in the invasion. They knew it. And so one of the few ways that they could defend against it is they flooded a lot of Normandy, or as much of Normandy as they could.
Really?
They would allow the tide to come in, and there are these big gates at this place called La Barquette. They call them the La Barquette locks. And whenever the tide comes in, they would normally you would keep those gates closed so it keeps the water from coming into the area, and then whenever the tide goes out, you can open them up and the Douve River keeps going out. I don't know exactly how that works, but that's approximately what it was. But what the Germans did is they just opened up the locks and just let all that water come in, and it flooded incredible areas in Normandy. And you could be ranging from anywhere from 2 feet deep to like 7 or 8 feet deep. And paratroopers coming in with 100, 150 pounds of kit were landing in that and drowning.
Yeah.
Like guys were literally drowning in less than 2 feet of water because they had so much equipment, and it was all on the upper half of their body that they literally could not sit up. And they were all wearing life jackets, but even their life jackets could not inflate enough to get them above the water, and a lot of guys drowned.
Jeez.
Private PFC Manny Haney, he was a Fox company of the 506th. And he came out, he was second in his plane. His platoon leader was first in the door, and then there was another guy after him, and they jumped out. And he thought that they jumped at a super low altitude of like 200 feet. Because they jumped, actually ended up, it was a cloud bank. He thought it was like ground fog, but it was literally like a cloud in the air. And so like he's preparing for landing after his chute opens, and he goes through this cloud. And then all of a sudden he looks underneath him. He said it looked like a mirror, like it was all water. And he's like, oh crap, like we're all going to die.
Yeah.
And so he has a machine gun in a leg bag that he actually kept. It didn't fall off his leg whenever he jumped. And so he takes off his helmet. He lets his leg bag go, and he takes his knife off of his leg, and he cuts the rope. So he's dropping all this equipment that he possibly can. And then he plops down onto the railroad track that was going through this, like literally it's the only raised up ground in this particular area, and he lands right in the middle of that. But the guy who jumped before him and the guy who jumped behind him died.
Wow.
They drowned in those fields. And so those raised areas, they were called causeways. Even off of Utah Beach, there were causeways. There were flooded areas right behind the beach so that tanks and jeeps and trucks and regular infantry could not get off of Utah Beach without going on these raised roadways that came through those marshy areas. And so that's where all the German artillery and so forth was engaged at. So like in Band of Brothers, whenever Winters takes over the guns at Brigcourt Manor, those guns were firing onto exit number 2, Utah Beach. And so it saved a lot of lives whenever they took those guns out. And so this causeway, it was off of, I believe that they call it the N13 road or the N13 highway. And it was a raised road that comes out of Saint-Côme-du-Mont and kind of goes southeast, and it goes and it meets up with Carentan. And Carentan, the reason why it was important is because that's where the bridges were, where American armor could link up from Omaha and Utah Beach. If the Germans held that, they'd be able to keep the two forces separate from each other, so they wouldn't be able to mutually support one another. So it was tasked to the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, Colonel von der Heydt, to hold that area. And then they were sending up it was either the 16th or the 17th SS to go up and reinforce that position. Had they gotten there in time, it would have been it would have been bad.
Yeah.
But anyways, so the 6 Fallschirmjägers holding Carentan, and they have several companies and so forth on like the north side of town off the N13 road. And then here comes all of 3rd Battalion of the 502nd, literally almost single file down this road because they can't go off to either side because it's water. And so they have defensive positions overlooking that whole road. And so they're just throwing artillery and mortars all over the place. And then snipers, or not sniper. Most guys probably didn't have scopes, but
Sure.
just sharpshooters and guys that could, pick somebody off at 300, 400, 500 yards with a K98.
When they're all lined up.
And machine guns going across this area. And so like literally like guys are like on their bellies crawling across the top of this road. Some kind of would go to the far side and like partially submerge themselves in water and so forth, but it was bad. And there were 4 bridges that were along that causeway. And one of the bridges, the 6 Fallschirmjäger had blown. And so they made like this little like makeshift bridge out of like fence posts and wire. And they were like getting across that, but it was just a huge bottleneck. And then at the very last bridge, the Germans had put what's called a Belgian gate. And it was basically this huge metal, looks like a fence that's about 8 or 9 foot tall. And it's about, it was almost as wide as the road, but then it was deep too. So it was like 15 foot deep or something like that. And the whole point is a tank couldn't push through it or a vehicle couldn't push through it. He literally would have to get a bulldozer to move this thing. And so they put that literally right in the middle of the 4th bridge. And so all these guys that are, crawling through this thing are getting picked off left and right and so forth. But, and one of the guys, Chester Elliott, had a machine gun. And rather than going through where the Belgian gate was, he's like, I'm going to run along the bottom of the river or the bottom of the stream to get to the other side of this thing with this huge 1919 machine gun on his shoulder. And he carries it and he almost drowns, just trying to walk this thing across. And he finally ditches it. And he comes up and Colonel Cole is right there and he like helps him get out of the water and he's like on his back just the side of passed out and he's like, you're nearly drowned with that thing. And Cole gets enough of his guys on that side of the road and they're like, and there was a farmhouse about 400 yards away to the south. And that was Colonel von der Heidt's command post. And then there were 6 FJ guys all over the place. And so Colonel Cole, gets his guys and they're all on the far side of the line. And Colonel Cole is just standing up on the road and there's just bullets coming all around his feet and stuff like that. And he's like organizing this attack. And he comes up to like a group of guys of which I believe Chester Elliott was one of them. He's like, what are you guys doing? And he's like, we're pinned down, sir. And like, there's literally bullets kicking all over his feet. And he's like, no, we're not pinned down. Like, we're going to get up and we're going to go get those SOBs. And he calls in some artillery, and some smoke. And then they end up doing well, first off, he sends out 1 platoon, to kind of get to the first hedgerow and kind of like help bridge some of that gap. The Germans let them get within 75 yards and they open up and all the guys hit the ground and pretend to be dead. They killed a couple of them. They wounded a couple of them, but other guys are like literally laying there on their backs and they're like, when's Colonel Cole going to come get us? Exactly. That's exactly what it was. And Colonel Cole, about an hour and a half later, is like, he initiates his assault. He tells everyone to fix bayonets. And he's like, whenever I blow this whistle, like I'm going to charge out there and you guys be right on my tail. And calls in some artillery, calls in some smoke, and then he gets up and he starts running and like only like 4 or 5 guys go with him because artillery and stuff's going off and they're hearing a whistle. Like
there's a testament to your leadership if anybody gets up and runs with you.
Exactly. Like either the information wasn't disseminated to them or they didn't hear the whistle or whatever. And finally it takes him a minute to get everybody up and going. And he's just out there with a 45, just like randomly shooting, at the Germans across the way. And then everybody else comes up and meets his position.
Did they do a scene? They did a scene similar with Winters, right?
That was in Holland. That was on a place called the Island. Okay. Later on in Holland. So it was after the operation had failed. Operation Market Garden was a little bit different than Normandy because Normandy was all under American command. Market Garden was all under British command. And they were using the paratroopers as just line infantry, because that's what they did with their own paratroopers, the Ox and Bucks, the British paratroopers and glider guys that took over Pegasus Bridge on D-Day. Like those are like elite shock troops, and they kept them on the line for like a month and a half, and there was like less than a platoon of them or something like that left, like a huge waste.
Yeah.
And they were doing the same thing, but this time with American paratroopers in Holland, and they were on the line for like 78 days. 78 days in consistent combat.
Yeah.
Like constantly being shot at, and constant artillery, because right across the Rhine River was like the heartland of German manufacturing. So all the artillery shells and mortar shells and stuff like that right there.
Yeah.
So literally it was to the extent where one guy being outside of his foxhole was attracting rounds from German 88s. Like literally, they were shooting cannons at individual soldiers. Like it was a nightmare, and that's where that took place. Where his bayonet charge took place, and they ended up taking out of action basically 2 companies of SS. Some of them got away, but that was a crazy thing that happened there. And so this thing happened in Normandy with Colonel Cole and his 3rd Battalion, and he was awarded the Medal of Honor for that, but he would never actually get the Medal of Honor. He would be killed in Holland in September, just a few months later, being shot by a sniper.
You don't hear of too many bayonet charges anymore.
No, no, definitely not. Definitely not. They were rare even in World War II.
Sure.
Like guys would fix bayonets, but rarely would it be like a full-on bayonet charge, but that was one of them. But, talking some more D-Day stories, talking Dan McBride. So whenever he came down on D-Day, he was like the 3rd or the 4th man in the stick. And Dan was a rifle grenadier. So, having an M4 with a 203 on it and so forth, like that's all new age. Back in the day, they were using just regular rifles that had rifle grenade attachments on the end. It was literally just like an extended piece of steel about 4 or 5 inches long. And then you had these rifle grenades that would slip over the top of that, and you would load a blank into your rifle and shoot that. And Dan, he was still using, his regiment didn't get the new adapters for the M1 rifles. So he was on an 03 Springfield, so, bolt action. And an 03 Springfield can't be broken down. An M1 rifle, you drop out the trigger guard and you can separate the stock from the receiver, and it breaks down into those 3 pieces, and you can fit it into a rifle bag called a Griswold bag that you go and it straps across the front of your parachute. And that's how most guys were jumping their M1s. So even whenever they hit the ground, you got to put your weapon together before you can get it into action. And so Dan McBride, he can't jump with an 03 Springfield because it can't be broken down. Very difficult to get through the small door of a C-47. And so it's put into what's called a parachute bundle, or an equipment bundle underneath the aircraft. So that's something that you don't see in Band of Brothers, but almost every C-47 flying from England to Normandy to drop paratroopers, they had 6 bomb racks, is what they look like, as a bomb rack underneath the plane, 2 by 2. So there were 3 rows of 2. And they had different types of bundles, A4s, A5s, A6s, and they would put machine guns, ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, all that kind of stuff inside those para bundles. And then there was like a release switch just to the right side of the door whenever guys would exit. And so Dan put his 03 Springfield in one of those drop containers, and then he had a folding stock carbine that he put in a basically a big holster, a sheath that was on the side of his belt. And so he would actually be jumping with a weapon, but then whenever you would hit the ground, the way that they trained it, and it worked out very well, is whenever they would exit, he would be like the 3rd or the 4th guy, and as he would exit, he would reach up and he'd hit the buttons on that switch, and it would release the para bundles. And you have to keep in mind that each one of those bundles is 100 to 200 pounds. So as soon as all those things would release, the plane would do one of these because it wanted to get lift. And so he would hit that switch, make his exit, and he would more or less come down on top of the bundles. So he was able to get his weapon very easily during all the training jumps that they did. Well, on D-Day, he goes through, everyone's packed up with so much equipment, 150 to 200 pounds worth of stuff. And he's 3rd or 4th man at the door. And he goes, and The first few guys make their exit, his platoon leader and such make their exit. He goes up to the door. He's reaching up for the switch. He doesn't know if he hit that switch or not. But then all of a sudden, the plane's going this way, the door's on this side, right? All of a sudden, the pilot banks to the right like this. And Dan literally falls face first out the door. And as he falls out the door, he scrapes his shins from his kneecap to the tops of his ankle on the door going out. So it banged him up real bad. And then all of a sudden, he's doing this. He literally somersaults through his risers and his suspension lines as his chute is starting to open. And then he gets his opening shock. And, the first thing you do in airborne operations whenever you get your opening shock is you lift your head up and you look up at the parachute to make sure that, one, your parachute is open, but two, to see if you have any blown panels, see if any of the gores have blown out. And if you have more than a couple panels blown and you see that you're falling faster than everybody else, you pop your reserve. So he looks up and he sees the ground, and he looks down at his feet and he sees his chute. He's dangling upside down in his parachute. And he's like, oh crap. And so he does a crunch in midair. And he's trying to untangle his feet from his risers and his suspension lines, and he hits the ground. So he jumped it. Very low
Real
altitude.
close.
Don't know exactly how low, but it was low. And he smashes into the ground and knocks him unconscious. He said he doesn't know how long that he was passed out for or knocked out for, but he knows that every single part of his body hurt. He said that every part of him hurt, even his hair hurt, because he hit the ground so hard. So he gets up, he gets out he sheds his equipment, or he sheds his parachute, and he pulls out his carbine, and he starts, making his way out of this field. Nobody else is around him. It's super quiet outside. And so he's got his M1 or his M1 carbine, and whenever I envision it, is he was kind of looking like Elmer Fudd, going through
very quiet.
Very quiet. and he's literally he'll take a step and then, stop, look, listen, smell, wait for a couple minutes and take another step. He said that it took him 4 or 5 hours to get a couple hundred yards. And so it's just before daylight, and all of a sudden, an automatic weapon opens up on his position. So he hits the deck, he rolls over a couple times, and he's trying to get a bead on where this is coming from. And he said that it was too fast to be a 1919 machine gun, but it was too slow to be a Thompson. So he knew that it wasn't another GI, because there were, a lot of friendly fire, a lot of blue on blue incidents happening on D-Day. And so he knows that it's a German. And he figures out where the German is at this hedgerow, and the German keeps shooting in the same position where Dan went down at. And so Dan's like, okay, I'm going to fix this guy. And he goes over and he gets alongside the hedgerow that the German is in. So the German's down here, and he's up here. And so he follows down the edge of this hedgerow, and he gets on the immediate opposite side from where the German is at, shooting through this kind of opening in the hedgerow. So he pulls the pin on a Mark II frag grenade, and he tosses it over the top. And hedgerows in Normandy are different than pretty much anywhere else in the world, because, a hedgerow, we think is literally just like bushes or trees, just like a tree line. Right. Well, that's not how it is in Normandy, because what it is over the hundreds and thousands of years that they've been farming there, whenever farmers would plow their fields and, hit rocks or other garbage or stuff like that, they would just take all that stuff and they would put it in these lines of hedges, and so it would literally build up dirt, and literally you'd have hedges that were 7 or 8, 9 foot of dirt, and then trees and bushes and stuff growing on top of it.
It's like berms.
Yeah, exactly. And the paratroopers had no idea of these, because you can't see that in an aerial photograph. You just see trees.
Right.
So they went in expecting, English hedgerows, and all of a sudden they run into this bocage in France, and it ended up being a huge problem, especially for armor. And so anyway, Dan pulls the pin and he throws this thing over the top, and then he backs up and then he runs as fast as he can, and he gets up on top of that berm right as his grenade goes off, and then he just dumps all 15 rounds of his carbine into this German on the other side. He doesn't know if the grenade got him or if it was him. But he goes down there to the German, and he wanted to ditch his carbine as fast as possible. He hated that weapon.
Really?
Oh yeah, because the M1 carbine is is a really great weapon, but it's not that great at killing people.
Okay.
It's kind of like the World War II equivalent of 5.56.
Okay.
It is a 30 caliber cartridge, but it is much shorter than like a standard 30-06 M2 ball or M2 armor piercing that the M1 was firing. You can shoot that thing 1,000 yards and knock out an elk. It's not a problem. Carbine, not that way. So he wanted to ditch that thing as fast as possible, and so he goes over to this German. And he had this futuristic looking rifle, which was the Sturmgewehr 44. So that AK-47 looking rifle. And he called it the Buck Rogers gun. Buck Rogers was like a sci-fi comic of the time because this thing looks so futuristic. And so he picks this thing up. And we know that Dan was pretty shook up because Dan's like a real gun guy. And so he just picks up this weapon and just takes off. He doesn't drop the magazine out to see how much ammo is in there. He doesn't pick up any extra magazines off this German. He just splits. So like we know he's like pretty amped up there. Adrenaline's pushing pretty hard. And so he goes out and he finally hits this hardball road, this asphalt road. And there he runs into one of his buddies, and then he runs into a few 82nd guys. And 82nd guys, they're miles and miles away from their drop zone. And one of them is Lieutenant, and he's like, Lieutenant, you know where we are. And he's like, I've been looking at maps for the last couple hours, and as far as I can tell, we're somewhere in Europe. So he has no idea where he is.
We're in Normandy.
So they set up, along this road, and then all of a sudden this Ford hardtop starts driving down the road, but it's painted camouflage. And so like they're watching this car coming barreling down the road, and Dan's buddy can see that the guy in the front seat is wearing a German helmet. So he's like, oh, they're Krauts. They open up, his buddy kills the driver, and the car kind of barrels off into a ditch. And then a German officer comes out of the back, and he starts fiddling with something on his belt. And then Dan shoots 4 or 5 rounds, and he was very close because all the ammunition that he shot hit the German. So he was very close with this automatic weapon. And then the gun goes dry. That's all the ammo that was there. So he's like, okay, I got to get a new weapon now. So he goes over to that German officer and he takes off his belt because there's a pistol on there. And then he must have found a rifle or something else there because he walks off with something. And they get in the car and they turn it around. And they're like, okay, we're going to take it where it came from. And we're going to see if we run into GIs, or, if they were running from GIs or if they were coming from a command post or something like that. They start going down the road. They start getting shot at, and they're like, okay, to heck with this. And they get out. And later on that day, they are in a ditch, and they're been shot at. They've been having firefights and so forth all day. And this glider pilot, American glider pilot, starts walking down the road like, it's Sunday afternoon back in the States. And Dan's like, hey, you better, get off that road. You're going to get your butt shot off. And he jumps in and he looks over at Dan, and he's got this black leather belt with a black holster on it. And his eyes get the size of golf balls. He's like, hey, what kind of pistol do you have there? And he's like, I don't know. I haven't even opened it up yet. So he opens it up, and it's a German Luger, and which was, prize souvenir status.
Oh yeah.
And that the glider pilot's like, oh, I'll give you $100 for that. And Dan's like, I'm in France. What the heck am I going to do with $100? Right. And the glider pilot's like, oh, well, I've got my, issued 1911. Like I'll trade you straight up, and I'll just say that I lost it. And Dan's like, okay, like I'll make that deal. It's easier to get ammunition and magazines and stuff like that for that. So he makes the trade. And sometime later, I don't know if it was later that day, I don't even know if it was in Normandy, but he's, cleaning that 1911, and it's an actual 1911. It's not a 1911 A1, so it's like an old World War I model. And for some reason, he looked at the serial number, and the serial number is 10126. Well, Dan was in the 101st Airborne. He was in the 502nd, which was the 2nd Regiment of that division, and then he was in Fox Company, so he was in the 6th Company. So somebody in his company was almost fated to have that 1911.
Yeah, right.
And so he took that 1911, he carried it all the way throughout the war. He killed a lot of Germans with it, and then he smuggled it back to the States at the end of the war, and he shot that almost until his dying day. Every week he would go out and shoot it. He was a real shooter.
Nice.
And he shot it so much he actually cracked the slide on it and had to replace it, and he switched out the sights to post-market sights that were a bit more up to scratch, and then he gave it to my friend Mark Bando, Mark Bando is like the ultimate historian of the 101st. Like, there's nobody alive that has interviewed more vets from the 101st than Mark Bando.
Really?
Like, you have to find his books because his books are absolutely fantastic. The stories that come from there, a lot of stories that I tell you, are stuff directly coming from Mark, either from his word of mouth or from his books. Exceptional writing, and incredible amount of depth in the stories, an incredible amount of research and finding like, okay, what number were you in the stick? Who was in front of you? Who was behind you? Where those guys individually landed? How long it took them to get together? Like, amazing information. And so Mark Bando had it. And then a couple months later, Dan called him up and he's like, hey, Mark, I don't want to, take this away from you, but like my great nephew or whatever, he's asked for that pistol and he's up in Michigan, where not too far from you. Would you mind, if he took it? And Mark was like, okay, let me hold on to it for a couple months and then I'll take it over to him and pass it off. So, that firearm is back with the family now.
That's good.
But Dan was something else. And he went on, and the night of Cole's charge. So he was 2nd Battalion. So he came in right behind 3rd Battalion. So after Cole made his bayonet charge, 2nd Battalion comes in, reinforces the position. And that night he goes out on a patrol with either 17 or 19 guys. And Dan is the lead scout. And so he goes out there, they're going down this road, and all of a sudden they start hearing hobnails and stuff like that walking on the road. And hobnails, like, you knew that they were Germans. American boots all had rubber soles and stuff like that. The Germans, they had leather soles with iron nails in the bottom of them. So they made a very distinct noise, especially whenever they were walking on cobblestones or dirt roads or whatever. And so he gives everybody freeze. Everybody, gets down real quiet, and like 60 Fallschirmjäger walk down the road. And Dan said he literally could have reached out and touched their boots. And so like they stay low, they stay quiet. And the lieutenant, he was a 2nd lieutenant. So a lot of people don't know that paratroopers in platoons, they had 2 lieutenants because officers were supposed to lead from the front, and because they were supposed to be taking so many casualties, they needed a senior platoon leader and an assistant platoon leader for whenever the senior lieutenant got shot. And so he was a 2nd lieutenant, so he was an assistant platoon leader, not as experienced. And he goes up to Dan and he's talking to him, and he's like, okay, we're going to go up this road another 200 or 300 yards, and then we're going to set up an ambush. And if any more of these Krauts come through, we're going to light them up. So Dan's like, okay. And so they cross the road and they're going up this ditch, and Dan stops and he lets the guy behind him go ahead and be lead scout because he's wanting to check the progress of everybody coming up behind them, make sure everybody's staying together. And then he feels, somebody tap on his shoulder, and he turns around to the left, and he thinks that it's the guy that went up in front of him. It's a German Fallschirmjäger in the trench with him. And he came up and tapped him on the shoulder thinking he was another German.
Oh, shit.
And as he turns, he sees the Screaming Eagle patch on his left sleeve, and his eyes get the size of golf balls, and he turns around and he starts trying to huff it out of the trench.
The German?
Yeah. And Dan levels off with him, and he shoots 3 or 4 times and drops him right in the middle of the road. And then for some reason, this lieutenant came up and he's like, oh, hey, let me borrow your rifle. And he took his M1, and Dan had his bayonet on. And this lieutenant walked up to this German and he stabbed him like 3 or 4 times. He was already dead. And he bayoneted his body 3 or 4 times. And on the last time that he stuck him, it stuck into his body and he couldn't get the rifle out. And so he fires the rifle, he discharges it to kind of dislodge it from the German, and it worked. But what he did, and then he gave the rifle back to Dan. He's like, okay, keep going up this road.
Just wanted to help you out with that.
Yeah. And
wanted to get yours in there too, man.
And so Dan goes back up, and he's lead scout, and he comes up to this stone wall, and he goes to look up over the top of it. And just as he does, a German Fallschirmjäger looks right over the top, right back in his eyes. And Dan's like, oh crap. So he levels out with him, and unbeknownst to him, whenever that lieutenant discharged his rifle, for some reason the gun short-stroked. So
he didn't have a round in the chamber.
So he didn't have a round in the chamber. It might have even had the spent casing still in there, but it went back far enough to cock the hammer. And so he levels off with him, he pulls the trigger, click, thing doesn't go off, and Dan's like, oh crap. The German shoots, misses Dan, and then another German who is just behind him, Fallschirmjäger. So these are paratroopers against paratroopers. Yeah. He fires, it pierces Dan's jacket, grazes his belly, doesn't break the skin, literally just grazes his belly, burns him. Wow. And then it hit him in some way, shape, or form in, I believe it was his left arm, and gave him just like a little flesh wound, nothing crazy. And then his other guys got up there and they shot up the Germans and so forth. And then they got behind a wall, and then they stayed there all night, and no other Germans came. Well, the next morning, Dan and 3 guys are around this kind of opening in the wall. Dan's on one side, this guy's on the other. And his buddy kind of leans his head out, as the sun is coming up, he kind of leans his head out to see what's out there. Shot rings out, and the dude falls backward. His helmet falls off his head. And like they heard like a loud pinging noise, like it hit his helmet. The dude sits up like nothing happened, picks up his helmet, looks at it. The bullet hole went through the front of the helmet and then kind of came in a direction like this and came out the side like that. And he looks at it and he's like, well, I can't take a bath in that anymore. Puts it on his head, and it was like nothing happened. And a little while later, they're like, okay, we're going to pull out. Like we're a little too far extended here beyond the MLR, the main line of resistance. We're going to fall back. And the guy that's sitting next to Dan rolls over, and Dan said that he set off a bouncing Betty. So a bouncing Betty is a landmine where, you trip it and it literally jumps out of the ground and it shoots out a bunch of ball bearings and so forth. He called it a bouncing Betty, and talking with Mark Bando, he's like, no, it wasn't a bouncing Betty. That would have killed all of them. It was what they called a castrator. And it was almost like a bullet that went into like a little spike that went into the ground, and whenever you step on it, it would shoot you, basically. Toe popper. They called it a castrator because it would literally point up right at your crotch, right? And so that like thing, a toe popper? Kind of. Like that? Yeah, kind of.
That they used in Vietnam?
Kind of similar, but not as much explosive. Like it wouldn't blow your foot off. Mark actually has one of these castrated. I think he has several of them, decommissioned or deactivated, obviously. And so like that happens, they pack him up, they get back to the line, and his lieutenant sees that, Dan is, wounded in the arm. He's like, hey, get your butt back to Utah Beach, get your butt to an aid station. And Dan's like, this is nothing.
And he's
like, no, like get back there. And so he gets in a Jeep, he goes back to Utah Beach, and he like goes and he's like, hey, I need a bandage for my arm. And the guy's like, get your butt on the boat. And there's a big LST, landing ship tank. He literally like Sherman's, come out of this thing onto the beach. And he's like, no, like I'm just wounded. He's like, get your butt on the freaking LST and get out of here. He gets on the LST. And he runs into his senior platoon leader, who is Lieutenant Downey, and he served under Downey through the whole war. He stayed the senior platoon leader. He wasn't, promoted to executive officer or company commander or anything like that. So he was under the same guy, which was rare. And he came up to him, and Downey was lying on his stomach on a stretcher, and he had a bandage on his backside. And Dan was with him whenever he had gotten shot. And he actually had 4 bandages because he had 4 holes. He got shot in one of his butt cheeks, went in one side, came out the inside of his butt cheek, went into the other butt cheek, and came out the other side.
Ow.
He joked that he had 4 buttholes.
Yeah, 5.
and he walks up to him and he's like, hey, Lieutenant, where you been hit? And he's like, daggum well where I've been freaking hit and all this kind of stuff.
$1 million wound.
Yeah, and so that's how he got back to England. How are we doing on time?
We got about 15 more minutes.
Cool. I'll continue Dan's story then. So, he goes back to England, and then a couple days later, the whole 101st comes off the line, or, a few days later, whole 101st comes off the line. They get sent back to England. They get refit. They get geared up for several other missions, but literally like they're like a couple of them were scrubbed while they were like in parachutes. Like they were ready to go, and they're like, oh, Patton overran the drop zone. Mission canceled. Wow. Then Operation Market Garden comes along. And Dan becomes a machine gunner. So he's carrying a 1919 A6 machine gun. It has a bipod on the front and has a stock on it. And so he gets one of the new parachutes. So whenever guys were jumping into Normandy, they had the standard T5 parachute, and it's a 3-buckle parachute. There's a chest buckle, and there's a buckle on each one of your legs, and then there's the belly band that wraps around your stomach. That was a real problem for guys trying to get those buckles undone, and a lot of guys were killed because they couldn't get out of their parachutes fast enough. They were landing in the flooded areas and they were drowning, or there were Germans around and they couldn't get out of their chutes. Lieutenant Colonel Wolverton, he was the battalion commander of 3rd Battalion of the 506th. And whenever he jumped in on Normandy, they don't know if he was killed in the air, if he was stitched up by a machine gun during his descent, or after he got on the ground. And by the ground, he got caught up in a tree. And so his body is hanging there, and either he was stitched up there, like I said, as he was coming down. Whenever they recovered his body, they couldn't identify him. The Germans had taken his dog tags off, and he was a West Pointer, and they took his ring, which had his name engraved in it, and he had no identification on him. So, he went months. He was listed as MIA. His folks didn't know if he was alive, and then they finally identified his body from his ASN, his Army Service Number. Which basically your now it's your social, but back in the day they would assign you a number, and guys would put that into their clothes because it was also their laundry number. It would be the first letter of their last name and then the last 4 of their ASN, and a lot of guys were identified by that whenever they couldn't find their dog tags, but then also guys would be misidentified by that because they would wear each other's clothes. So a guy would grave registration, they'd check, and his jacket would be one number, one name, and his pants would be another one. But long and the short of it, they did identify his body a few months later. But the thing that was so horrific about whenever they found his body is he had over 150 bullet and stab wounds in his body. While he was hanging in the tree, the Germans used him as target practice and bayonet practice, and shot him up, and then obviously, took all of his valuables and so forth. At the end of the war, a lieutenant, I believe it was in Germany, was processing POWs, and he saw that this POW had a West Point ring, and it checked it out, and sure enough, it was Wolverton's, and I think that they beat that German within a half inch of his life.
Wow.
And they mailed his ring back to his family,
Nice.
And it disappeared. Nobody knows where it is today. But one of the things that was so interesting is that Colonel Wolverton had a bracelet like this. It was very, very common to see ID bracelets in World War II. You see Marines have them, Army, all the different branches had them. And then paratroopers, they would obviously adorn them, with a jump wings like that.
That's awesome.
And so he had one that was very similar to that. And there's actually a very famous picture that I'm sure that you've seen of there's actually a series of pictures of Colonel Wolverton just before Normandy, literally, it's dark outside. A lot of people don't know that they took off from their planes in the dark. It's dark outside. He's at the tail of his aircraft and he's adjusting his parachute and he's putting his parachute on. And they snapped this picture. And if you look, you can see that he's wearing his ID bracelet on his right arm. And
do you know whose this is, or is this
that's just an original?
Okay.
But Wolverton's is very, very similar to that.
What else did you bring?
Well, let me finish the story about that. So, his body would have been identified had that been with it, but it had disappeared. Nobody knew where it was until 2022. A Frenchman who owned the property where Colonel Wolverton was killed was doing some landscaping, and they were removing a tree stump, and they removed this tree stump, and in the dirt is that ID bracelet, and it doesn't have his name on it. It just had Bull, like Bull in quotes on the back, which was his nickname. And so they take it literally down the street. Like, he was killed within a stone's throw of the Dead Man's Corner Museum, where it stands today. And so they take it down there, and they took a couple months to identify it because it was just off of Bull. And if they look a little bit closer, RLW was underneath Bull, Robert Lee Wolverton. And so they identified it, and they literally went out, and that picture is about 30 foot tall, stamped on the side of their building, that picture of Colonel Wolverton with his ID bracelet. And they literally have a picture of like holding that bracelet with there. And they reached out to his family, and they're like, hey, we want to send this to you. And there's a bullet hole through it. It literally was shot off of his wrist. I don't think it broke the chain. I don't know how it separated from his arm. I mean, for all we know, his hand could have, with that many bullet wounds, his hand could have been shot off, and that's how it fell off. Right. But there was a bullet wound, or there's a bullet scrape through the actual ID bracelet. And so they found it. They notified the family, and they're like, no, we want you to keep it, and we want you to display it at the museum.
That's cool.
So anyways, Colonel Wolverton, because he couldn't get out of his parachute, if he was still alive whenever he landed, that's what got him killed. So a lot of guys died in Normandy. So by the time of Market Garden, they're like, okay, we need to do an overhaul in the T5 parachute. And so what they did, they couldn't start from scratch. They couldn't manufacture all new parachute harnesses. So what they did is they cut the buckles off the chest, and then they got their hands on what's called a quick release box, or a dial of death. Is how it's known. And basically what it is it has these lugs that go into it. And basically it sits on your chest, and the chest harness goes in and it clicks into the corners, and then the leg straps come up and hook into the corners as well. So if you look at some pictures of guys, not everybody, but most of the guys in the 502nd had those particular harnesses. And what you would do is, after you would hit the ground, you would turn that dial and you just smash it. And then all the buckles literally just fall off. And you can shed the chute in seconds. So Dan had one of those parachutes, which was a unique piece of kit for that time.
Yeah.
And he jumped in with his 1919 in a leg bag, like in Normandy, but he was able to hold on to it for the actual jump and so forth. He jumped into Holland, and then he went through and he fought in Bastogne. And maybe next time we can kind of go more into his story, because it's something else.
Bastogne was a hell of a fight too.
Yeah. So as far as what,
show me what else you got here.
Yeah. So
got a little bit of time.
So here I've got this cloth escape map here. So paratroopers, air crews and paratroopers, anybody who is behind enemy lines, a lot of them would be issued these. If you watch Masters of the Air before they go on a mission, you see they're handing out all this equipment, and one of the things is like these little brown packets, and inside those brown packets were these cloth escape maps. And the point of these maps is they're cloth, so they don't disintegrate whenever they get wet, and then they're easily concealable. Like you can, wad this thing up in your fist and you can barely see it. So guys would take these, and they would, some guys wore them as scarves around their neck. There's a couple pictures of that. Other guys would actually sew them into the lining of their jackets. So if they were ever captured, they'd be able to use this for escape and evasion. And so I actually make reproductions of this map. And so I had Dan sign this one.
That's his signature.
Yeah, that's his signature. Wow. Funny thing about his signature, I've seen him sign many, many things over the years, and he always wrote it the exact same way. Dan McBride, F502-101AB. And the last time I saw him was just a couple months before his death. He invited me down to his house, and I spent like 8 hours with him, and I took so much. I brought kit bags full of stuff because Dan remembered everything. And I'm like, hey, what did you jump into Normandy with? What did you jump into Holland with? And he literally would just like, I did this. And he would just like put his whole belt together of all of his equipment. He's like, and I would carry my pistol here, and all this kind of stuff, and go into like these great details. And one of the things I brought down was one of those parachutes with a dial of death. And he's like, and sure enough, he
still remember
did it exactly how it happened and all that kind of stuff. And then I brought a 1919 A6 machine gun, and I had spoken with him so much I knew exactly how he set that gun up. And so I set it up the exact same way for him. Cool. And he thought that was the coolest thing ever. And
whose dog tag is that?
These are Dan's dog tags.
Okay.
So these are made on a World War II machine. They're not his original tags, but they have all his information. And so I take these whenever I go and jump. So I always think of Dan. Dan was probably the closest relationship I had to a World War II vet other than my own grandfather's.
Okay.
So Dan was really, really special to me.
Yeah.
And so I always try and remember him and tell, as many people that I can about his stories.
How old was he when he died? Was it 91?
He was just about to celebrate his 99th.
No, wow. 99.
I believe. April 9th would have been his birthday, and he passed away in February.
Oh, wow.
I was planning his birthday with the World War II Airborne Demonstration Team. One of the reasons why I went down to his house and brought all that stuff is because I wanted to find somebody who is his same height and weight, and I was going to kit him out exactly how he jumped into Normandy with and exactly how he jumped into Holland with, to be able to take pictures as kind of like a doppelganger type thing. That's why I went into so much detail with that. But he passed away before that.
Do
was
it on
able
his
to
birthday
happen.
or to do it at the next?
We were going to do it because April Jump School falls right about that same time as his birthday would have been. So we were, would have been planning a party and so forth. This is a small bit of parachute from Jack Agnew. Jack Agnew was one of the Filthy 13. So one of the guys with, the mohawks with the war paint. That was those guys. And whenever I went to jump school in 2008, one of my jump buddies was, his name was Russ, and he was basically Jack Agnew's surrogate son. Basically, he had an extremely close relationship with him. They were hunting, like they grew up together. And whenever he had landed on D-Day, he took his jump knife off his leg and he cut off a section of parachute, and he made like a silk scarf for himself, or a nylon scarf out of that camouflage parachute. And Russ had that, and he was jumping it for our jump class. And he took off, and for me and another guy, he took his knife out and he whipped off a little piece of it. So that's a piece of Jack Agnew's parachute from Normandy.
That's cool.
So that's pretty cool and unique. And another thing that he had was his knife. It had a custom hilt on it. That was a deer antler. And while they were in England, they were super short on everything in terms of supply. So food and stuff like that, they were always getting garbage most of the time, until they went to the marshalling areas just before Normandy. Then they were eating like kings, fattening the pig for slaughter kind of thing. So Jake McNeese and the Filthy 13 guys, they're like, to heck with this. There's a bunch of deer and stuff like that around here. We're going to go out and poach some deer and get some venison. And so they'd go out onto the Lord's land and they'd poach these deer, but they couldn't shoot them because the game warden would be alerted of their presence and come down and bust them. And they'd, be thrown in the brig and all that kind of stuff. So what they would do is they'd go out and they would hide in the bushes, and they'd jump out and they would lasso the deer with their jump ropes. And they'd jump out and they'd get on its back and they'd slit its throat.
Holy shit.
And so they did that 3 or 4 times. And Jack Agnew slit the throat of this one deer, and they hooked it through its legs, and they were hoisting it up into the tree, and they were going to, let all the blood come out and come back a couple hours later. Well, they hoisted this thing 20 or 30 feet up into the air to get it up into the branches. So, it couldn't be seen by the game warden or whatever. They just finished tying this thing off, and who comes around the corner but the freaking game warden? And he's like, what the heck are you guys doing here? And Jack Agnew drops that knife in the grass, and they're like, oh, we're just going out for a walk, and literally the game warden's right there, and blood is dripping into the grass behind him, and he doesn't know, and he's like, you guys get the heck out of here, and so forth. And so they leave. Well, they get activated and they get sent to their marshalling area, so they never come back for that deer carcass. Well, Jack Agnew went back to Normandy. I think it was for the 60th. It was for one of the anniversaries. And before he went to France, he went to England, and he's like, oh yeah, this is where we were training and so forth. This is where we'd go and poach deer. This is where I kill. Hey, here's my knife. He bends down in the grass, and the knife is still there.
What?
From 65, however many years later it was. And so he had that knife with him, and so he was jumping it
Cool.
because he didn't get to jump it in Normandy. Russ got to jump it at jump school. Another thing that the guys would do is called a short snorter. And guys, just before Normandy, they were being issued French currency as invasion money to like pay off the French people, where it's like, oh, like, hey, sorry, we killed your cow, or like, hey, where are the Germans? Kind of like a blood chit type thing. And so guys would take this, and it was like a customary or like a traditional type thing to sign money. And so guys would take these things and they would be signing them. Everyone in the stick would put their signature on it. And so this one was actually my stick whenever I jumped into Normandy for the 80th anniversary.
What kind of dollar is that?
So that's a French franc.
Okay.
So that's French invasion currency.
Wow, that's cool.
You
said this is so minefield.
Germans would mark their minefields, for their own guys. As they would like dig the field, they'd have these all over the place, and then whenever they pulled away from the position to let the Americans come in, they'd pull all these stakes out. But it were like these little wire hangers, and they would go through that loop on the top of the flag. And they would mark that. And Lieutenant Colonel Weinsberg, who was the commander of the 377th Field Artillery, he had a whole bunch of those. Took them and he brought them back with all of his stuff. And Mark Bando has all of his collection. Literally, he has his M42 jumpsuit, which is basically in the exact same condition that it came out of Normandy on. It still has the CC2 treatment in it. It's exactly the same. And he has all of his maps and incredible amount of information, an incredible grouping of artifacts.
Where can people go if they're interested in attending one of these events or maybe joining the ADT? Just go to the website?
Yeah, so for the ADT, WWW, obviously that.
We don't have to say that part anymore.
Yeah, exactly. It's ADT, WWII-ADT.org. And that's the place to go for that. Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. .org.
Very
and
cool.
you can go and you can find their jump schedule, because we go and we jump all over the United States at air shows and things like that to, share veteran stories and like show people what it was like to jump out. Our whole mission with the World War II ADT is to remember, honor, and serve our veterans. And that's how we do that.
That's cool.
And so like going to that, going to the Gettysburg Museum of History in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, like literally where the battle took place.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not a Civil War museum. They have some Civil War artifacts there, but there's an incredible amount of 101st artifacts in that museum.
At Gettysburg.
At Gettysburg, of all places. It's owned by a guy named Eric Dorr, and it is one of the best groupings that is in a public place in the United States. Dick Winter's uniform that he jumped into Normandy with is there. The uniform that Dick Winters wore into Holland and Bastogne is there as well. Like, that famous picture of Dick Winters underneath that arch in Holland where he's holding his helmet. Yeah. That uniform, his sidearms. There's a G43 rifle with a scope on it, a German weapon that was captured that Winters brought back. That's there. A bunch of stuff from Ronald Spears.
Have you ever met Dick Winters?
I didn't. He passed away before I had the opportunity to meet
any of the Band of Brothers crew.
Yeah. I've
are any of them still alive?
Earl McClung, Shifty Powers. No, the last one passed away 2 or 3 years ago. I'm so sorry, I don't recall the last gentleman's name.
Yeah.
But yeah, he passed away here 2 or 3 years ago.
What about the Pacific? Are any of those?
No, I mean, all those guys are the same ages, so there's very, very,
there's
very
nobody
few.
left.
There's hardly anybody left. Dan was one of the last guys, and it's like, a lot of regret comes from, those guys passing on and, kind of missed opportunities.
Absolutely.
I mean, like, even like there's obviously like the little stupid stuff where it's like, oh, I wish I'd asked Dan what weapon he carried here, or, where he carried, there's little details like that.
The loss of the resource.
Yeah.
Right?
And there's like the little things like that like, reenactors and stuff like that people care about, but, most everybody else doesn't. But then there's also like, what was this guy's name, or what was that guy's name, or, what was the date on this, where that history is being lost to, history.
Yeah.
But there's like even bigger stuff, like with Dan in particular. The last time that I saw him, whenever we were there for like 8 hours or whatever at his house, whenever I would, be talking with vets, I'd ask him like, hey, like, what was your experience with faith? Like, what was your what was your journey and so forth with that? Because so many of those guys were like, my father-in-law, his dad, so my grandfather-in-law, I never met him. The last name was Williams. He was a medic in the Pacific, and he was on Okinawa. He was Army medic. And one of my father-in-law's friends, whenever they were in like middle school or high school or something like that, he made a comment of like, "Oh, I'm atheist" or whatever. And Perry's dad was driving around. And he heard this conversation, and he turned around and he's like, "You're an atheist because you've never been a man to walk out of a 2-man foxhole in the morning, like whenever your buddy dies." And I was talking with Dan, and I asked him what his, experience with faith was and so forth. And he said on D-Day or just before D-Day, there was, a huge spike in church attendance and all that kind of stuff. Guys trying to get right with the Lord or whatever before, possibly meeting their demise and all that. And Dan's like, I never went to church beforehand, and I didn't feel right about doing it then. That it's like I would feel kind of hypocritical or whatever.
Sure.
And all that kind of stuff, and it's kind of like that.
Treat God like an insurance plan.
Yeah. And it's kind of like that kind of mentality of like looking like, okay, like I'm just going to like take this on the chin as a man, like I'm just going to take that hit.
Yep.
And it bothers me to this day. I think about that.
Really?
That I didn't say something about that, and that I didn't say like, Dan, that's the point. Like that is the point of faith. That is the point of God, of being loved unconditionally. That it's not about what you do. Anything of what you've been is. It's like you are saved by grace. You're saved by grace. And I never got to tell him that, and he passed away 3 or 4 months later.
So he kind of felt like he wasn't being authentic if he were to go to church just because he might die.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's like, from a worldly standpoint, it's like, oh, like that's honorable.
That is, I understand his reasoning. It's like, I haven't come to you yet. I'm not going to come to you now.
I totally get
just to save me from my own decisions.
I totally get it.
Yeah.
But then it breaks my heart that I missed the opportunity to tell him like, that's the point. Like that is the point. Like the whole idea of being saved by grace and grace alone.
Well, as a father, and I don't know, but I can't imagine that there's any point in my son's life, no matter what he had done, if he came to me and wanted a relationship again, that I would say no.
Yeah.
Like there's no way.
I mean, that's
at any
the
point,
heart of the Father.
I'm there.
That's the heart
and
of
I'm
the
willing.
Father.
I just want him to come to me. Yeah.
The whole prodigal son thing.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. Like God is the Father, and He just wants you to come back.
So he died having not found religion, or
I don't know that for a fact.
Or Christianity.
I don't know that for a fact, one way or the other.
Yeah.
I met with him October 6th was the last time that I saw him, and then he passed away, I believe, February 16th. It was in the middle of February of the following year. It was actually that date ended up being super significant for me because it was the date that Stand the Door 1944, my business, became a possibility because I was in a job where I had been for almost 10 years, and just that day I gave my notice.
Oh,
I gave my 6-month notice. And within a year of that date, Stand in the Door 1944 was my full-time job. So it was and so like I gave my notice, and I'm like distraught is not that's a little dramatic, but like there was like a lot going through my mind, and
Sure.
I call my buddy Dan, who's my age, and I'm like, hey Dan, can we like go out to dinner? And while I'm sitting there having a conversation with him, I get a text from Mark Bando. And he's like, hey, Keith, I just wanted to let you know, given your relationship with Dan, I wanted you to be one of the first to know that he just passed away this morning, or this afternoon, or, whenever it was. And it just like hit me like a ton of bricks. And so I don't know what his experience was with faith after the last time that I saw him.
Well, I don't know how God handles that stuff. I'm curious to find out, how much goes into just your life's choices and how much weight actually goes into the technicality of choosing him. I don't know. Be interesting to find out, though. We're all going to find out eventually. Man, thank you for coming in.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
I love the stories. I love the era, the amount of detail and study that you've put into this it's fascinating, and I really appreciate your efforts to keep this stuff alive.
Yeah,
and teaching these kids. I don't know how often you do those, but I think that's awesome as well.
Yeah,
they need to hear it. They need to know where we came from, and hopefully we won't repeat this insanity in the next century.
Yeah, we have to remember.
Yeah,
like we have to remember.
Yes,
and not only from the standpoint of like where we're going, but also from the standpoint of honoring those men.
For sure.
Where it's like Ernest Hemingway once said that every man dies twice. Once with his physical body, I'm paraphrasing, once with his physical body, and the last time somebody says his name.
Yeah.
And in that way, some men can be immortal.
Yeah.
And so it's like, that's why I try, and I don't hit every name, I forget names and I'll forget dates and so forth. But, it's to give people a baseline of like, hey, this man existed. This is what he did.
Yeah.
This is what he gave up so that we can have this.
Yeah. I love it. Well, if you're listening to this, cheers to Dan McBride. Here's to him. Thank him for his service. And thank you, Keith, for coming in. I look forward. Hopefully we can do this again and just start telling some more stories.
Yeah.
I'd love to. Cool, man. Thank you.
You bet.
Awesome. Stay zero.